The air is warm. Not the warmth of summer in the way you know summer, not the warmth of afternoon sun on concrete or the stored heat of a city at the end of a long day, but something older and more complete than that. You are standing at the edge of a forest that has existed, in one form or another, for longer than any word in any language can easily name. And the warmth is the warmth of a world that has not yet been interrupted. It wraps around you like something that never learned to have edges. The ground beneath your feet is soft with years upon years of fallen matter, leaves and flowers and the quiet debris of a world that has been turning and dropping and beginning again for 66 million years before this particular evening. You breathe in, you let your shoulders drop. Somewhere above the canopy, something calls. Not a bird exactly, or rather precisely a bird, though the question of where one creature ends and another begins is something this story will spend its hours gently answering. Wings move in the upper branches. A long shape, green-grey and ancient, lifts from a branch and drops into the warmer air below the tree line, sailing without effort between trunks that are wider than any tree you have seen in your own time. Magnolia flowers, already evolved, already ancient by the standards of everything around them, have dropped their white petals into the mud at the roots. The air smells of pollen and green water and the sweet rot of things becoming other things. This is how it smells. This is how the world breathes when it does not know that anything is about to change. This is the last ordinary evening of an age that lasted 165 million years. Tomorrow will begin differently. The evening after will be unrecognizable. But tonight the forest simply stands, and something small and feathered is sleeping in the branches 40 feet above the ground, its heartbeat faster than yours, its dreams if it dreams, full of the world it has always known. 66 million evenings from now, which is to say tonight, the night you are listening to this story, the descendants of the creatures that survived will be asleep in trees very much like these, breathing slowly, waiting for dawn. Sleep now. Let the ancient world come to you. There is a question that most of us learned to stop asking, not because we found the answer, but because the version we were given seemed sufficient. The question was, what happened to the dinosaurs? And the answer we received was compact and final. An asteroid fell, the world caught fire, the skies went dark, and the great creatures that had ruled the land for 165 million years simply ceased to be. It was a clean story, the kind of story that satisfies children because it has a clear end, and that satisfies many adults for the same reason. But the truth, as it so often is stranger than the clean version and more continuous and more beautiful in its complexity than we were originally given to understand. The truth is that some of them survived, not hiding in remote valleys, not lurking in deep lakes waiting to be photographed by curious travelers, but in the real, traceable, biological sense of the word. A lineage of dinosaurs persisted through the extinction event. They were reduced to the smallest possible number. They lost most of their diversity, most of their size, most of the ecological roles they had played for tens of millions of years. But the lineage held. And in the 66 million years since, it has diversified into something remarkable. There are, at this moment, roughly 10,000 species of them alive on Earth. More species than there are of mammals. More diverse in form and behavior than almost any other group of vertebrates on the planet. You know them as birds. The sparrow on the wire is a dinosaur. The pelican riding a thermal over a coastal inlet is a dinosaur. The crow on the roof. The pigeon in the plaza. The hummingbird suspended over a red flower in someone's garden somewhere in the warm afternoon of the world right now. All of them are dinosaurs. All of them carrying in their bodies and behaviors the accumulated inheritance of a lineage that predates our own by more than 60 million years. Their bones are hollow, in the exact way that theropod dinosaur bones were hollow. Their nesting behaviors mirror what we find in fossils. Their air sac respiratory systems trace directly back to the breathing architecture of large predatory dinosaurs. They are not the descendants of dinosaurs. They are dinosaurs, still here, still alive, still singing at dawn. This is the story of how they did it. How a small group of feathered creatures made it through the worst catastrophe this planet has experienced since complex life first evolved. How they survived fire and darkness and the collapse of every ecosystem they had known. how they then diversified over 66 million years into the extraordinary variety of forms that fill the sky today. This is a story about survival, about what it actually means to endure something enormous, and about what happens in the long, quiet aftermath of catastrophe when life begins, slowly and stubbornly, to find its way back to the world. It is not a violent story, though the event at its center was deeply violent. What we will dwell on is aftermath, silence, the slow return of sound, the ways that emptiness fills itself in time. If you are listening to this now, in the dark, in the warmth of wherever you are, with the sounds of your own world fading to something quieter than usual, if your eyes are already growing heavy and your thoughts are beginning to drift from the sharpness of the day towards something softer, then you are already doing what this story asks of you. You are letting the present moment grow soft around the edges. You are giving the deep past permission to come forward. And the deep past is patient. It has been waiting 66 million years. It can wait a few more minutes while you settle into sleep. Let it come. The birds outside your window are already dreaming. This is their story. And in some quiet way, because you are here and alive and listening, it is yours as well. Come back now. Come back to the very moment before everything changed. Come back to the last morning of the age of dinosaurs, to a world that did not know what was coming, that was simply living the way it had always lived, enormous and alive and full of the particular confidence that comes from 165 million years of continuity. Come back to the warmth of a Cretaceous afternoon. Come back to the feathered things sleeping in the trees and the heavy-bodied things grazing at the forest edge and the ancient insects singing in the undergrowth. Come back to the world before the light came. Before the silence, before everything began again in ways that nobody who lived through the beginning could have imagined. The forest is waiting. If you enjoy listening to sleepy prehistoric dinosaur stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly, and there are many more ancient worlds waiting to be explored together. Drop a comment below letting me know what time it is where you are. Listeners have checked in from Sydney at sunrise, from Sao Paulo at midnight, from Oslo at noon, and from quiet rooms in cities and towns and villages all over the world, all listening to the same ancient stories at the same moment. It never stops being remarkable. Now, let us go back, 66 million years back, to the last perfect morning of the age of the dinosaurs. You are walking through the late Cretaceous, and the world around you is nothing like the world you know, and something like every dream you have ever had of deep old forest. This is 66 million years ago, in the final geological stage of the period called the Cretaceous, and the forest through which you move has been standing, in one configuration or another, since before any ancestor of yours existed. The trees are familiar in their general shape, tall and straight-trunked and reaching for light, but the details are different in the most wonderful way. The leaves are too large. The ferns at your feet are waist-height and dark green and densely packed. Mosses cover everything that stands still long enough to be covered. The air is warm and slightly humid, and it has a smell that is very hard to describe with any precision, rich and green and not quite like any forest you have walked through in your own life. The atmosphere of the late Cretaceous was different from the atmosphere you breathe today. Carbon dioxide levels were somewhat higher, and the world was warmer because of it. Global temperatures ran several degrees above what they are now, which meant that forests extended further toward the poles than they do in your time. Antarctica existed but was green. Northern Canada was forested. The tropics, where you stand now, were extraordinarily lush. Layers of vegetation stacked one atop the other from the root systems in the waterlogged soil all the way up to canopies 100 feet overhead. Everything grew, everything competed for light and water and space. Every available surface was colonized by something trying to turn sunlight into life, and the result was an ecosystem of extraordinary density and complexity. Here is something that scientists have only recently determined about this particular morning, something so specific it still seems almost impossible that we can know it from stones. The asteroid that ended this world struck in spring. We know this because of a site in North Dakota called Tanis, a preserved riverbed where the day of impact is recorded in extraordinary geological detail. Fish discovered there, killed by the seismic waves of the impact within hours of the event, have growth rings in their bones the way trees have rings in their trunks, recording seasons in the fine structure of the mineral. Those rings show that the fish were in their spring growth phase when they died. The last morning of the Cretaceous was a spring morning. The trees were in new leaf. The insects were thick in the warming air. Something about knowing this makes the story feel more specific, more real, as though the particular morning has been handed back to us after all this time. Walking through this spring world, you begin to notice the things that are not trees. They are everywhere. You see them first as movement, something large and dark shifting behind the fern wall to your left, something smaller and faster crossing the open space ahead of you before disappearing into shadow. This is a forest full of animals in the way that forests are only full of animals when they have been undisturbed long enough for every niche to be occupied, for every possible role to be filled by some creature or other. The late Cretaceous was exactly that kind of world. It had been evolving and diversifying for 165 million years. Every edible plant had something that ate it. Every herbivore had something that hunted it. The web of life here was ancient and intricate and dense beyond easy imagining. The large shape behind the fern wall resolves as you watch into something you recognize from illustrations and museum displays and your childhood imagination, though seeing it here is different from any image you have ever carried. It is a hadrosaur, a duck-billed dinosaur, broad-bodied and heavy, moving slowly through the undergrowth with the unhurried confidence of an animal that has spent millions of years as a dominant large herbivore. It is not alone. A younger one follows close behind, smaller, moving with more uncertainty, stopping to nose at a low-hanging branch. They are a soft brown-green, their sides dappled faintly with a pattern that makes no sense until you look at the light filtering through the canopy overhead and realize the pattern matches it almost exactly. They are hidden, despite their size, by being exactly the color of the world they live in. What you might not immediately notice in the presence of something so large is the smaller things. But they are here, and in some ways they are more important to this story than the hadrosaurs are. Look up toward the lower branches of the nearest tall tree. There. Something is moving, not the wind, not a falling leaf, but something deliberate. A shape the size of a large raven is working its way along a branch, using both its feet and its grasping hands, pausing every few steps to look down at the forest floor with sharp, bright eyes. It has feathers, proper feathers, layered and functional, not so different in appearance from the feathers on the birds you know. It has a long tail, longer and more flexible than any modern bird possesses, but it flies after a fashion. It lives in the trees, and when it moves with something very like grace. These feathered theropods, small dinosaurs with feathers, capable of at least limited flight or controlled gliding, were common in the late Cretaceous. They were not marginal curiosities or evolutionary experiments about to be discontinued. They occupied real ecological space, filling roles as insect eaters and small prey hunters and scavengers and opportunists in the upper and middle layers of the forest ecosystem. Some flew with reasonable efficiency, others glided. Some had feathered wings but remained primarily ground dwellers, using their feathers for insulation and display rather than for flight. The diversity within this group was extraordinary, and it had been building for tens of millions of years, ever since the first feathered theropods appeared in the Jurassic and began their long exploration of what feathers could do and where wings could take a creature that had started as a ground-dwelling predator. In the forest around you, you can count perhaps a dozen species of feathered dinosaurs if you are patient and observant. The large one in the branches is something close to the ancestral line of modern birds, small and alert and capable of sustained flight. Lower down, near the ground, another feathered form, shorter winged and heavier bodied, built for speed across the forest floor rather than speed in the air, forages through the leaf litter, flicking leaves aside with practiced efficiency, finding insects and small invertebrates in the soil beneath. These ground-dwelling feathered forms were especially diverse in the late Cretaceous. They had evolved to exploit the forest floor, which was its own complete world, full of resources that the aerial forms could not easily reach. This is a detail that will matter enormously when the story moves forward. The ground-dwelling feathered dinosaurs, the ones that nested in the soil, that foraged in the leaf litter, that built their lives in the lowest layer of the forest ecosystem rather than in the canopy or the mid-story branches. It may seem in this moment like a minor variation, This group of birds lives up high, that group lives down low. But in the months and years that will follow the asteroid impact, the difference between up high and down low will be the difference between extinction and survival. For reasons we will explore in their proper time, the forest floor will prove to be slightly less fatal than the forest canopy when the sky changes. For now, though, all of that is in the future. The forest is whole. Everything is alive and going about its business. Beyond the trees, the landscape opens briefly into a clearing, and in the clearing you can see something that the museums of your time have not fully conveyed: the sheer scale of the dominant dinosaurs. A family group of ceratopsians, perhaps 6 or 7 of them, is moving through the open space. They are low to the ground despite their bulk, their great frilled heads swinging as they graze, their bony ornaments catching the afternoon light and scattering it in colours. Their footsteps are felt as much as heard. The ground absorbs the vibrations of their weight, muffled by the deep mat of vegetation, and yet there is a rhythmic quality to it that travels up through the soles of your feet, something almost musical, something that your body recognizes as weight and continuity, and the deep bass note of a world that has been doing this for a very long time. You notice that the ceratopsians, like the hadrosaurs, have smaller companions. Birds, nearly modern-looking birds, walk among the great animals' feet or perch briefly on their backs before startling off into the undergrowth. These birds are taking advantage of the insects disturbed by the ceratopsians' passage, a strategy that their descendants will practice on every continent, with every large herbivore, for the next 66 million years. The relationship between birds and large animals is ancient. It was established here in this world long before the event that changed everything. And when large animals returned to the landscape, millions of years after the extinction, the birds already knew exactly what to do around them. The sky above the clearing is a deep, improbable blue. A few white clouds stack themselves above the distant mountains, their tops brilliant in the late afternoon light. And in the sky, shapes move. Not feathered theropods these, but pterosaurs, the flying reptiles, distant relatives of the dinosaurs, occupying the upper airspace with enormous membrane-winged efficiency. They do not share the sky willingly with the feathered flyers, but they have learned to coexist, and the aerial ecosystem above this Cretaceous forest is as layered and complex as the forest itself. Large pterosaurs patrol the open sky above the canopy. Medium-sized ones hunt the forest edges where clearing meets woodland. Small ones work the interior, threading between branches in the dim mid-story, catching insects in their long-toothed jaws. There is a sound that this world makes that no modern forest makes. It is underneath the sounds of wind and leaf and animal call, something low and pervasive, more felt than heard. It is the sound of the insects. The late Cretaceous insects were already, in many ways, modern insects. Beetles and flies and moths and true bugs and ants and wasps, all present, all diversified into hundreds of thousands of species. But their numbers, in a world without significant predation pressure from modern mammals and without agricultural disruption, were staggering. The biomass of insects in a Cretaceous forest was probably greater than the biomass of all the larger animals combined. They were everywhere, in the soil and the wood and on every leaf and in the air above the canopy in invisible drifting clouds. And they fed everything. They were the protein base on which the small dinosaurs and the feathered theropods and the tiny mammals built their entire lives. The mammals. Yes, they are here too, though you would have to search carefully to find them. They hide well, as small things in a world of large things learn to hide with extraordinary thoroughness. Under the tree roots, in tunnels in the soft ground, in the dense tangles of fern at the forest edge. They are small, the largest of them no bigger than a modern house cat, most of them considerably smaller, and they are mostly nocturnal, coming out to forage in the hours of darkness when the large dinosaurs sleep. They have been here for almost as long as the dinosaurs have, evolving alongside them for 160 million years, surviving as small and opportunistic and warm-blooded shadow dwellers. They have been waiting a very long time for their moment. They will need to wait a little longer, but not much longer now. The afternoon is moving toward evening. The light changes in the particular way that light in dense tropical forest changes, thickening and deepening, moving from white gold to amber. The shadows in the forest lengthen until they are no longer shadows, but simply the dark between the trees. The hadrosaurs drift toward the water's edge, where a wide, shallow river glitters between banks of horsetail ferns to drink in the cooling air. The ceratopsians have moved on, their distant passage marked by the shaking of a cluster of palms at the far edge of the clearing. The sky is changing color, and the pterosaurs are settling on their cliff-face roosts. The birds, the feathered ones, the survivors-to-be, are gathering in their evening roosts, calling softly to each other as they arrange themselves on branches, tucking their heads under their wings in a gesture that is unmistakably, recognizably the same gesture that a bird will make 66 million years from now in the tree outside your window. This evening will not be significantly different from the 10,000 evenings before it in this particular forest. The same routines will play out. Predators moving into position as the light fails, prey animals finding safety in numbers or in water or in simple invisibility, insects beginning their evening chorus, the small feathered things settling into sleep. The world has been cycling through these routines for so long that they have achieved a kind of gravity, a sense of inevitability. They feel permanent. There is nothing in this evening, in the quality of the light or the temperature of the air or the behavior of any animal in this forest that suggests that anything is about to change. No heightened tension among the animals, no unusual calls, no premonition. The world does not know. And yet, somewhere at the edge of the solar system, something is already in motion, has been in motion for months, perhaps for years, on a trajectory that will not be altered by anything this planet can do. It is travelling at speeds that have no reference point in the experience of any creature on Earth, dozens of kilometers per second through the black and cold of space, on a path that converges with the patience of gravity and the indifference of physics on this particular planet, on this particular spring morning that is even now moving toward the coast of what will one day be called the Yucatan. The creatures in this forest do not know this. They cannot know it. They go about their evening in the ordinary way. There is a question that comes naturally here in the quiet of this last evening. What is lost when an age ends? What do 65 million years of evolution amount to when measured against what came after? There are no easy answers to give. The Cretaceous was not a rehearsal for something more important. It was complete in itself, dense with meaning and ecology and the accumulated solutions of creatures that had been solving the problems of survival for longer than any of us can genuinely imagine. What is lost is real and vast and irreplaceable in any strict sense. But the story does not end with the loss. That is the most important thing to understand before we move forward. This is not a story about an ending. This is a story about what comes after, about the feathered things and what they carried through. The small feathered dinosaur in the high branch shifts in its sleep, rearranging its wing against its side, tucking its face more deeply into its own warmth. It does not know what tomorrow will bring. It only knows the branch beneath its feet and the comfortable darkness and the slow rhythm of its own heartbeat, which has been beating in one form or another for 165 million years. Tomorrow will come, the light will change. The sky will do something that no sky in the entire history of complex life on Earth has done, something so complete and so final that it will change the planet forever. But that is tomorrow. Tonight the forest simply breathes. Tonight the world is simply the world, as it has always been, as it has been so long it can barely remember not being this way. Let that feeling stay with you as you drift. The feeling of a world that has been doing this a very long time. The warmth, the soft ground, the sound of water somewhere not too far away, the river catching the last light, the fish moving slow and calm beneath the surface. The birds, one after another, falling silent as the dark comes down, the forest breathing. 66 million years ago, on the last ordinary evening of an extraordinary age, the world fell asleep. And some of what fell asleep that night woke up on the other side of the longest night the planet has known. We will follow them through it, gently, without hurry. The story has time. The night is long. Rest now, and let the ancient world settle around you. The morning begins in the ordinary way. The forest wakes incrementally, the way it always has, the way it always does. First the insects, which never quite stopped their work through the dark hours. Then the early birds lifting their voices into the pre-dawn grey with a quiet urgency that sounds now like something prophetic, but was then simply the same song they had sung every morning for as long as that particular species had existed. The ceratopsians at the edge of the clearing are already moving, grazing in the cool of the early morning, pulling at the ground-level vegetation with their horned beaks. The hadrosaurs are drinking at the river. The pterosaurs, the early risers among them, are already airborne, riding the first thermals of the day upward into a sky that is, in this moment, completely clear and completely blue, and full of the ordinary promise of a spring morning. It is spring. We know this. We know this from the fish at Tanis, from the growth rings in their bones, from the extraordinary specificity of what preserved geology can tell us when the conditions are exactly right. It is spring in the Northern Hemisphere 66 million years ago, and the world is as alive as it ever gets. Every creature in every niche is occupied with the particular urgent work of the season. Breeding, nesting, establishing territory, finding food for the new mouths that will arrive in the weeks ahead. The small feathered dinosaur in the high branch left its roost before dawn, before the sky was even light enough to see clearly, already hunting the insects that gathered at the warmth of last night's decaying leaf matter. It has been doing this for weeks. It will do it again tomorrow, or at least that is what it expects. The thing that is travelling toward this world, and here is something that scientists have only recently begun to seriously debate, something that changes the texture of this story in a subtle but significant way, may not be a simple asteroid in the way that word is usually understood. Some researchers now believe the Chicxulub impactor was not a single chunk of rock orbiting the Sun in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, but a fragment broken from a much larger body during a gravitational encounter, possibly a piece of a comet that was itself broken apart and deflected onto a new trajectory by the gravitational influence of Jupiter. This distinction matters not because it changes what happened when it arrived, but because it reminds us that what struck Earth 66 million years ago was itself part of a larger story, a cascade of events in the outer solar system of which this planet knew absolutely nothing. From the perspective of any creature on the ground in the Yucatan Peninsula on that spring morning, the end would have come with almost no warning and would have arrived faster than any living thing has a framework to understand. The impactor was roughly 12 to 15 kilometers across. That is larger than Mount Everest is tall. It was traveling at somewhere between 60 and 70 kilometers per second, fast enough to cross the continental United States in less than 2 minutes. The atmosphere, which slows and disintegrates most objects that enter it, had no time to do meaningful work on something this size. The impactor reached the surface of what is now the Gulf of Mexico essentially intact, and at an angle, something scientists have been carefully refining in recent years, of approximately 60 degrees. That angle mattered more than it might seem. A direct perpendicular impact would have concentrated the energy more narrowly. An impact at a very shallow angle might have delivered less energy to the rock beneath. 60 degrees was close to the worst possible scenario, because the rock beneath the Yucatan was not simply stone in the ordinary sense. It was sulfur-rich limestone and evaporate, sedimentary rock saturated with the chemical compounds that, when vaporized by the impact's heat, would become the atmospheric agent that did so much of the killing in the months and years ahead. The precise angle of the strike maximized the volume of sulfur-rich material that was vaporized and propelled into the upper atmosphere. Had the asteroid struck at a different angle, at a different location, the story of what came after might have been different. The feathered ones might have faced a worse extinction, or a more survivable one. The mathematics of trajectories and angles determined which way the story went. The energy released in the first moment of impact is almost impossible to put in human-scale terms, but here is an attempt. The Chicxulub impact released approximately 10 billion times more energy than the nuclear bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The explosion lasted seconds. In those seconds, the impactor and the several kilometers of rock beneath it were vaporized, turned from solid matter to superheated plasma in an instant. The crater that formed, 180 kilometers across and 20 kilometers deep, opened and closed again in less time than it takes to draw a single slow breath. The shock wave that traveled outward from the impact site through Earth's crust triggered earthquakes far larger than any in recorded human history at every plate boundary on the planet, simultaneously within the same hour. A wave formed in the Gulf of Mexico that staggers the imagination even now. The initial displacement of water created a wall approximately 1.5 kilometers high in the immediate vicinity of the impact site. It radiated outward from the Gulf into the surrounding ocean basins with the speed of a jet aircraft. The coastlines of what are now Mexico, Cuba, and the southeastern United States were not places where large animals survived the first few hours. The geological record from sites around the Gulf of Mexico shows the evidence plainly. Thick layers of jumbled sediment deposited in chaotic stacked patterns, indicating not a single wave but multiple surges, the sea going and going again as the water found its catastrophic new level. But the wave was a local catastrophe. What spread to the rest of the world in the minutes and hours that followed was something different and in some ways more thorough. Within 20 minutes of the impact, molten glass spherules began falling from the sky across the entire surface of the Earth. This is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. The impact had ejected so much material at such velocity that some of it left Earth's atmosphere entirely, arced through space, and re-entered the atmosphere on the far side of the planet, still carrying enough energy to be incandescent. Tiny droplets of rock that had been liquefied by the impact's heat fell out of a clear sky on every continent, on every ocean, in the Arctic and in the deep tropics and across every temperate plain on Earth. For creatures caught in open areas, it was like standing inside a furnace. In forests like the one you have been imagining, the canopy provided some protection. Glass spherules falling through dense vegetation lose much of their heat by the time they reach the ground. Fires started in the higher branches where the spherules landed directly on dry material, but they burned patchily, irregularly, extinguished in some places by the moisture of the spring vegetation and spreading in others where the growth was drier and more exposed. The first hour after the impact was not uniform death everywhere at once. It was chaos, catastrophic and complete in some places, survivable in others, depending on how close to the impact site you were, how dense the vegetation above you, how much rock and root and soil was between you and the sky. And during this first hour, many things were still alive. The hadrosaurs at the river, sheltered by the water itself and the steep banks of the valley, were alive. The small mammals in their underground tunnels were alive, insulated by meters of soil from the falling spherules and the fires in the canopy above. The fish in the rivers were alive, right up until the seismic waves reached the water and shook it in what geologists call a seiche, a rhythmic back-and-forth sloshing of water in an enclosed basin. The fish at Tanis died from this sloshing. Their bodies were buried in the sediment, disturbed by the water's motion, and there they stayed for 66 million years, waiting in the dark beneath the stone to tell us what season it had been when their world ended. What happened in the hours that followed was the beginning of something that would last far longer than the impact itself. The ejected material that had gone into the upper atmosphere, not just the glass spherules, but billions of tons of pulverized rock and vaporized sulfur and fine carbon from the burning forests, was spreading at the altitude of the stratosphere, where there are no weather systems powerful enough to wash it out, no rainfall to bring it back down to Earth. It would circle the planet, propelled by high-altitude winds, covering the entire globe within days. Below it, the surface of the Earth would begin to change in ways that would take months to fully manifest and years to begin to reverse. The small feathered dinosaur that had been hunting insects in the high branch since before dawn was, by late afternoon, pressed flat against the bark of a tree trunk in a dense valley in the 4th or 5th hour after the impact. The fires that burned to the east had not reached this valley. The seismic waves had passed and the ground had stopped moving. The air was still, and it was cooler than it should have been for spring, and the light was strange, that flat, directionless quality that light takes on when the sky above is no longer simply air. The bird, if we can begin to call it that, did not know what had happened. It only knew that the world had changed in ways its body did not understand. The heat, the noise, the distant orange glow, and now this strange sky and this silence that was not quite right. What it did with that uncertainty was what small feathered creatures do when the world becomes confusing. It went still. It pressed itself against the bark, and it waited, because waiting is the most ancient and most reliable of all survival strategies, the one that every small thing living in the shadow of large things learns first. It waited, and in waiting, it did the thing that mattered most in the coming weeks. It conserved, it preserved, it stayed small and quiet, and did not waste the energy it had, because the world was changing in ways that would make energy the most precious thing there was. The soot from the wildfires was already reaching the upper atmosphere when the glass spherules stopped falling. Fine black particulate, the product of millions of acres of burning Cretaceous forest, rising on the thermal columns above the fires and being carried upward by the convective energy of the burning, up through the troposphere and into the stratosphere above. It combined with the pulverized rock and the vaporized sulfur already there, forming a layer that would prove, in the weeks and months ahead, extraordinarily effective at one particular thing: blocking sunlight, blocking the radiation that drove photosynthesis, removing the energetic foundation on which every food web on Earth was built. And so the light began to fade, not all at once, not in a single dramatic moment, but over days and then weeks. The sky above the surviving world grew darker. At noon, where noon had been the brilliant tropical blue that the ceratopsians had grazed under, there was now something dimmer and more diffuse, a grey-white light that gave no shadows, that carried no warmth, that was steadily weakening as more material spread across the stratosphere and the fraction of sunlight reaching the surface dropped below what the plants needed. The plants noticed first, in the way that plants always notice, not consciously, not with fear, but metabolically, at the cellular level, where the biochemistry of photosynthesis ran slower and then slower still as the light that powered it failed. The last image of this chapter is quiet. A small, feathered creature, one of the true birds, one of the ones that would survive though it does not know this yet, crouches at the base of a large tree in a dense valley in the third week after the impact. The fires that burned to the east and north have not reached this valley. The ground has stopped moving. The air is still and it is cold, genuinely cold now, a cold that has no right to be here in the tropics in what should be late spring. The sky above is grey, not the grey of cloud and rain, but the grey of something opaque and pervasive, a sky that is not letting light through. The bird is perfectly still, it is very cold, it is very hungry. It is waiting in the way that everything that survived the next few months was waiting, with a patience it did not choose and a stillness it did not plan, for something in the world to change. There is a particular quality to this waiting that deserves acknowledgement. Not the active, tense waiting of something that knows what it is waiting for, but the deep, metabolic, cellular kind of waiting that very small creatures with very fast metabolisms engage in when the world stops providing what they need. A kind of slowing, a turning inward. The heartbeat is still fast by our standards, but it is slower than it was before the sky changed. The body temperature is lower. The movement is minimal. Every calorie is conserved. Every breath is shallow. This is not resignation. This is biology finding its most efficient configuration for an emergency that has no precedent. This is what survival looks like in its earliest, most basic form. The darkness will deepen before it begins to lift. The cold will worsen. The silence will become more complete. But something in this valley, crouched against the bark of a Cretaceous tree in a world that has just been remade, is still alive, still breathing, still conserving, still waiting. That is the beginning of the next 66 million years. Not a triumph, not a plan, not a strategy with foresight. Just the simple, stubborn, biological fact of still being there when the darkness is at its deepest. We will follow this creature through what comes next. For now, let its stillness become your stillness. Let its patience become something you borrow for the night. The darkness does not last forever. Nothing lasts forever. Even this. There is no way to know what the world felt like from inside it, which is perhaps the right acknowledgement to make before we try to describe it anyway. We can read the chemistry of the rocks. We can measure the thickness of the layers of iridium and soot and volcanic ash that mark this moment in the geological record worldwide. We can model the atmospheric conditions from first principles, using our understanding of how particles of different sizes and compositions interact with solar radiation. But the actual texture of the world in the weeks and months and years after the Chicxulub impact, what it felt like to breathe the air and stand on the ground and look up at a sky that had forgotten how to let light through, that is something we can only approach through inference and imagination. What we know is this. The stratospheric layer of soot and sulfur and pulverized rock reached its maximum density within approximately 2 weeks of the impact. At that point, the surface of the Earth was receiving somewhere between 5 and 15% of the solar radiation it normally received. Some models suggest the reduction was even more severe, that for weeks after the impact, the surface was receiving less than 1% of normal sunlight. The plants, which had no framework for this, which had evolved in a world where the sun came up every day and provided the energy that drove every food chain on Earth, stopped photosynthesizing. Not slowly, not gradually. They stopped. The temperature drop that followed was rapid by the standards of climate change, though gradual by the standards of any individual creature trying to survive it. Global average temperatures fell by somewhere between 15 and 28 degrees Celsius from their pre-impact baseline within the first months of the darkness. In the tropics, where the Cretaceous world had been warm and lush and seemingly eternal, temperatures dropped to levels that had not been experienced there in tens of millions of years. Ice formed on ponds that had been tropical. Snow fell on landscapes that had no evolutionary experience of snow, on plants whose leaves and stems had no adaptations for cold, on animals whose physiology had evolved for warmth and abundance. This is the part of the story that is hardest to hold in the mind, not because it is violent, but because it is so thorough. The darkness and cold did not kill selectively. They did not spare the weak and take the strong. They removed the foundation, the base of the food pyramid, the primary producers, the plants and algae and photosynthetic organisms that converted sunlight into the chemical energy that everything else was ultimately eating. These simply stopped working, and without them, everything else stopped having a reason to continue. A hadrosaur can be enormous and successful and well adapted to its environment, but if the plants it eats are dead, its adaptations become irrelevant. Size and strength and speed all require food. Without food, they are merely the specifications of something that is in the process of ending. Scientists now estimate that approximately 75% of all species on Earth went extinct in the event and its aftermath. 3 out of every 4 species that existed on the morning of the spring that the fish at Tanis were swimming in, gone, not reduced in numbers, not relocated to different habitats, not driven to the edge, but recoverable. Gone, in the permanent sense that species go, removing from the world not just the individuals but the entire genetic library they represented, all the evolutionary solutions they had arrived at through hundreds of millions of years of trial and error. The Cretaceous mass extinction was the 5th major extinction event in Earth's history. It was not the worst in terms of raw percentage of species lost, but it was the one that remade the most visible world. The nuclear winter, as this period of cold and dark is sometimes called, though the term is borrowed from a modern human concept, lasted somewhere between 18 and 24 months. 18 to 24 months during which photosynthesis was so severely reduced that the primary food webs could not sustain themselves. 18 to 24 months during which the temperature remained far below what the surviving animals had evolved to handle. This is, by any measure, a long time. It is long enough that any animal with a reproductive cycle longer than a few weeks would fail to produce a new generation during the crisis. It is long enough that any animal dependent on seasonal plant growth would exhaust its food reserves and starve. It is long enough that the landscape itself would change, the dead trees falling, the root systems rotting, the soil without plant cover beginning to erode. And then, as the nuclear winter began its very slow retreat, something happened that was in its own way as disruptive as the darkness. The world began to warm. Not gently, not gradually back to what it had been, but dramatically past the pre-impact baseline, because the carbon dioxide released by the impact and by the burning of the world's forests was still in the atmosphere and still doing what carbon dioxide does, trapping heat, warming the surface. Within a few million years of the impact, global temperatures would be 5 to 10 degrees Celsius higher than they had been before the asteroid arrived. The world that the survivors would live in was not the Cretaceous world they had come from. It was something new and strange, hotter and wetter and structured around entirely different sets of species than the one they had been born into. But all of that was in the future. In the present of the darkness, the surviving world was learning a new way to be. What does survival look like when everything that used to sustain you has been removed? It looks like the things that can delay the need for sustenance, the animals that can slow their metabolisms dramatically, that can enter states of torpor or hibernation, that can wait in the dark on reduced resources while the world outside remains inimical to life. It looks like the things whose food chains do not depend on living plants, the detritivores and scavengers and animals that eat dead organic matter, which was suddenly available in quantities the Earth had not seen since the previous extinction event. The dead organic matter. This is worth pausing on. When the Cretaceous forests died, they did not immediately disappear. They fell. They decomposed, slowly, in the cold and dark, and they represented an enormous pulse of calories available to anything capable of processing dead plant material. Fungi thrived in the aftermath of the extinction in ways that nothing else could, blooming across the landscape in dense mats, digesting the fallen forest, breaking down the cellulose and lignin and carbon compounds stored in billions of tons of dead wood. The geological record from this period shows dramatic spikes in fungal spore counts in sediment layers, evidence of a world briefly dominated by decomposers rather than producers. Fungi fed everything else that was still alive in the dark. Insects played a crucial role in this period that is often underappreciated. Insects had survived every previous mass extinction, and they survived this one too, with significant losses but without the complete collapse that took the large vertebrates. Many insect species could overwinter as eggs or pupae, dormant forms that required almost no energy and could remain viable in the cold and dark for extended periods. When conditions improved even slightly, these dormant forms could hatch and begin consuming the abundant dead plant material, and insects were food. For anything that could catch and process them, insects represented a continuing food source through the worst of the darkness, a thin lifeline of protein running through the dead world. The freshwater environments were among the worst of the worst in some ways and among the best in others. The cold reduced water temperatures dramatically, which slowed the metabolism of aquatic creatures, but also, crucially, preserved more dissolved oxygen in the water. Freshwater fish and turtles and early crocodilians in rivers and lakes fared better than large terrestrial animals, partly because the water buffered the temperature swings somewhat, and partly because freshwater ecosystems are fed by organic detritus washing in from the land, and there was suddenly an enormous amount of dead organic matter washing into every river and lake on Earth. The streams ran dark with it. The lake sediments accumulated it in thick layers. Everything that could eat dead organic matter ate it, and some of them survived. The crocodilians, the early relatives of the modern crocodile, survived the extinction with relatively little modification to their basic body plan. This is one of the stranger and less appreciated facts about the event. Crocodile relatives had been around for more than 200 million years, and while many lineages went extinct in the KPG event, the lineage that led to modern crocodilians came through largely intact. Part of the reason was almost certainly their physiology, specifically their ability to survive for extended periods without food. Modern crocodilians can go without eating for up to 3 years under the right conditions. This capacity, which served them well in seasonal environments throughout the Mesozoic, became an extraordinary survival advantage when the food supply collapsed. They simply waited, they slowed, they endured. The darkness had another effect that is less often discussed but was ultimately important for the recovery that followed. It created a kind of reset at the level of competition. The dominant animals of the Cretaceous, the large herbivores and the large carnivores that depended on them, were precisely the animals most vulnerable to the collapse of plant food webs. Large bodies require large amounts of food. When the food was gone, the large animals went first, and they went quickly in geological terms. The ecological space they had occupied for 65 million years became empty. Every niche that a large dinosaur had filled was suddenly vacant, and that vacancy, that emptiness, was the condition on which everything that came after depended. Something that tends to get lost in the drama of the impact and the extinction is that the darkness was not universal in its severity. Some places were less affected than others. Deep valleys where cloud cover moderated the radiation reduction, high-latitude environments where the sun was already lower in the sky and organisms were more adapted to low-light conditions, freshwater ecosystems where the darkness had less direct effect on food availability, cave systems and underground environments that were effectively independent of the surface world. In these places, tiny populations of survivors held on, conserving and waiting and maintaining in however reduced a form the genetic continuity of their lineages. They did not know they were the future. They only knew they were cold and hungry and that the world had gone wrong in ways they could not name. And in the trees, in whatever trees were still standing, in whatever valleys had not burned, the birds. We have to say it again because it is the heart of this story. In the trees and on the ground beneath the trees, in the soil and the root tangles and the dense fern mats that were dying but not yet dead, the birds. Small and feathered and fast metabolizing and desperately, urgently hungry, they were also tremendously adaptable in ways that the large, specialized dinosaurs were not. They could eat a wide range of things. Seeds, which persisted long after the plants that produced them were dead. Insects, which were surviving in their own reduced and shifted form. Dead organic matter, which was abundant. They could move, relocating when one food source was exhausted to find another in a different place. Their small size meant their energy needs, though proportionally high, were small in absolute terms. The darkness lasted. It lasted and lasted. In geological time, 18 to 24 months is nothing, a layer in the rock so thin you might miss it on a casual reading of the sequence. But in the lived experience of a small bird trying to find food in a cold and darkened world, 18 months is an enormous span of time, long enough to represent dozens of generations for the fastest reproducing of the surviving species. Dozens of generations during which the ones who could survive on the least, the ones who could eat what was available rather than what they preferred, the ones whose reproductive cycles were short enough to allow new generations within the crisis period, these were the ones whose genes moved forward. The survivors of the darkness were not the strongest or the fastest or the most perfectly adapted to any particular ecological role. They were the most flexible. They were the smallest. They were the ones whose food chains had enough redundancy that the collapse of any single link did not mean the collapse of the whole. And they were the ones with the deepest reserves of patience, the ones who could slow and wait and conserve and endure until the sky changed. And the sky eventually changed. Slowly, in the way that all atmospheric changes happen, by degrees so small that no single moment marks the turning, but the turning happened. And when it did, the world that was left would never look like the world that had come before. Let the darkness soften now. Let it become simply the dark of your room, which is a different kind of dark entirely, the comfortable dark of warmth and rest and safety. Let the cold of the Cretaceous winter become simply the coolness of the air around you, which is not threatening but pleasant, the right temperature for sleep. The survivors are still there in their trees and their tunnels and their hiding places. They will still be there in the morning. And the morning, for them, was the most extraordinary morning that any lineage in the history of complex life had ever lived to see. 66 million years later, their descendants are still singing at dawn, as though to celebrate it. Not everything died. That is the sentence on which this story depends, and it deserves to be said plainly before we explore what it means. Not everything died. In every mass extinction in Earth's history, including this one, which was one of the 5 or 6 worst in the long story of complex life on this planet, something survived. Something always survives. This is not a reassurance in any cheap sense. The things that died are genuinely gone, and the world that existed before the extinction is genuinely and permanently lost. But life as a phenomenon, as a physical process operating on the surface of a medium-sized rocky planet orbiting a medium-sized star, is extraordinarily persistent. It has been finding ways to continue for more than 3 billion years, and the mechanisms by which it continues are subtle and various, and often invisible until the moment they prove decisive. The first thing to understand about survival in a mass extinction is that it is not about being the best. It is not about being the strongest or the most evolved or the most perfectly suited to your environment. In a mass extinction, your environment is the thing that is collapsing, so being perfectly suited to it is actually a disadvantage. The animals that survived the KPG extinction were not the champions of the Cretaceous. They were mostly the marginal ones, the small ones, the generalists, the ones that had been making do with whatever was available rather than dominating any particular niche. The hadrosaurs, those successful and abundant large herbivores, are gone. The small, opportunistic, warm-blooded things that had been living in their shadow inherited the Earth. Body size was one of the most important factors in determining who survived. The relationship is almost brutally simple. Large bodies require large amounts of food. When the food supply collapsed in the months after the impact, animals with large bodies starved faster than animals with small bodies. A full-grown hadrosaur needed to consume hundreds of kilograms of vegetation per day to maintain itself. When the vegetation died, the hadrosaurs had perhaps weeks, at most months, of stored energy to draw on before they starved. A small bird, by contrast, might weigh 30 grams. Its total daily energy requirement was a fraction of what the hadrosaurs needed, and the food sources available to it in the dying world, insects, seeds, the remains of dead plants, were sufficient to sustain it even when the lush Cretaceous ecosystem had collapsed entirely. But not all birds survived. This is something that is easy to forget in the telling of this story, and it is important to remember it. The birds of the late Cretaceous were numerous and diverse. They had been diversifying for nearly 80 million years by the time the asteroid struck. There were many different lineages, many different ecological strategies, many different body plans and diets and reproductive strategies, and most of them went extinct. Most of the bird diversity of the Cretaceous did not make it through the extinction. Current estimates suggest that somewhere around 75% of bird species went extinct at the KPG boundary. Only about 1 in 4 survived. What determined which quarter made it through is one of the most interesting questions in paleontology, and we are only beginning to understand the answer. One of the most important patterns that has emerged from recent research is the role of habitat. Where a bird lived mattered enormously to whether it survived. The birds that lived primarily in the forest canopy, the ones that roosted in the high branches and nested in tree hollows and depended on the forest structure for both shelter and food, these birds suffered catastrophically when the fires burned and the trees fell. The forest canopy was the most exposed part of the forest environment, the most vulnerable to the glass spheral rain, the most susceptible to fire, and the first to collapse when the darkness killed the trees. Canopy-dependent birds lost their homes and their food sources simultaneously. The birds that lived near the ground, or on the ground, fared significantly better. Ground nesting species, ground foraging species, birds that spent most of their time in the dense, low vegetation at the forest floor rather than in the high branches. These birds had access to seed banks in the soil, to insect populations in the leaf litter, to the rotting organic matter that was becoming the primary food source in the dying world. The soil itself provided thermal buffering, staying warmer than the air above it during the cold of the nuclear winter. A bird that spent its time near the ground was a bird that happened, by the accident of its ecological lifestyle, to be in the right place when the world changed. There is a quiet fact buried in this observation that has only recently been fully appreciated by scientists. The common ancestor of all modern birds, the single species or small group of species from which all 10,000 species alive today ultimately descend, was almost certainly a ground foraging bird. Not a spectacular flyer, not a canopy specialist, not any of the ecological roles that seem most impressive from our vantage point. A small, ground-dwelling generalist feeder. Something like a modern scrub robin or a ground dove, a creature comfortable on the soil and adaptable in its diet. The fact that all modern birds descend from a ground-dwelling ancestor is not coincidental. It is precisely because the ground-dwelling lineages were the survivors that all modern birds carry the legacy of that ground-dwelling way of life somewhere in their evolutionary history. The freshwater environments of the late Cretaceous and earliest Paleocene served as refuges in ways that the terrestrial environments could not. Rivers and lakes and wetlands buffered the temperature extremes somewhat, particularly in the early phases of the crisis. More importantly, freshwater ecosystems had a different kind of food web than terrestrial ones, one that could function on the dead organic matter washing in from the dying land rather than on living primary productivity. The animals in and around these freshwater environments, the fish and the turtles and the early crocodilians and the birds that depended on freshwater invertebrates and fish, had a better chance of finding food through the nuclear winter than the animals whose food chains depended entirely on living vegetation. The turtles deserve special mention here. Modern turtles are among the oldest surviving lineages of reptiles, a fact that speaks to their extraordinary resilience through geological catastrophe. They survive not through speed or strength, but through reduction. A turtle in difficult conditions can slow its metabolism to almost nothing, drawing on stored fat reserves and requiring almost no oxygen, burrowing into the mud at the bottom of a pond and essentially waiting out whatever the world is doing above the waterline. During the nuclear winter, many freshwater turtles would have done exactly this, entering a state of reduced metabolism and waiting in the cold mud for conditions to improve. They are doing something very like this right now, in ponds all over the world, waiting out winter in exactly the same way their ancestors waited out the end of the Cretaceous. The crocodilians, as we noted in the previous chapter, could survive for years without food, but there is something more specific to say about how they managed the transition. Modern crocodilians are generalist predators. They eat fish, they eat terrestrial vertebrates, they eat carrion, they eat almost anything available. This dietary flexibility, combined with their cold-blooded physiology that allowed them to reduce their energy requirements dramatically in cold conditions, made them extraordinarily well-equipped for the post-impact world. They did not need a functioning, high-productivity ecosystem to sustain themselves. They needed only the occasional meal, available in any form, at intervals that could be measured in months rather than hours. The crocodilian body plan, which has remained essentially unchanged for 200 million years, turns out to be extremely well designed for surviving the collapse of everything else. Seeds. The most underappreciated survivors of the KPG extinction. Seeds are, in a sense, life's most elegant solution to the problem of waiting. A seed contains the complete genetic information for a plant, suspended in a protective coating, dormant, requiring no energy, capable of remaining viable for decades, sometimes longer, under the right conditions. When the fires burned and the forests died and the photosynthesis stopped, the seed banks in the soil remained. Billions upon billions of seeds, stored in the ground at various depths, protected by the soil from the worst of the temperature extremes, dormant and patient. When conditions eventually improved, when enough sunlight returned to the surface to drive photosynthesis again, those seeds were ready. They are the reason the forests came back at all, the reason there were forests for the survivors to inhabit when the darkness lifted. And this is where the ground foraging birds found their critical advantage. Seeds were available, not in the lush abundance of the pre-impact world, but available scattered through the soil and the leaf litter, preserved and nutritious and findable by anything with the right beak and the right search behavior. Modern ground-feeding birds are extraordinary seed finders. A sparrow can extract seeds from among gravel with a precision that seems almost impossible until you watch it for a while. Seed-finding behavior was almost certainly present in at least some of the ground-dwelling feathered dinosaurs of the late Cretaceous, and in the post-impact world, that behavior became the difference between eating and not eating. There is a micro-hook buried in the timing of all this that invites reflection. The birds that would become the ancestors of all modern bird life were not the impressive ones. They were not the ones that would have caught your attention if you had been walking through a Cretaceous forest looking at animals. They were ordinary-looking, small, ground-dwelling, generalist feeders with no particular claim to ecological dominance. And this is precisely what saved them. Had they been specialists, had they been perfectly adapted to a particular food source or a particular habitat, the collapse of that food source or habitat would have taken them too. Their very ordinariness, their adaptable, flexible, make-do-with-what-is-available character was their greatest evolutionary asset in the worst moment their lineage had ever faced. There is also the matter of reproduction. Birds reproduce faster than large dinosaurs. A small bird can go from egg to reproductive maturity in a single year, sometimes less. A large hadrosaur or ceratopsian required years to reach reproductive maturity and invested enormous resources in each offspring. In normal times, this slow reproductive strategy was not a disadvantage. The Cretaceous world was stable enough, had been stable long enough, that the slow-growing large dinosaurs could maintain their populations through the ordinary replacement of generations. But when catastrophe struck, the ability to produce a new generation quickly became enormously important. Survivors who could reproduce within months of the crisis beginning could begin replenishing their populations while the crisis was still ongoing. Consider what this means in practice. A population of small birds reduced to perhaps a few thousand individuals by the impact and its aftermath. If those individuals are healthy enough to reproduce and if food is available in even small quantities, can rebuild its numbers exponentially within a few years. The mathematics of small-body fast reproduction is relentless. A pair of birds producing 4 or 5 eggs per clutch, 2 or 3 clutches per year, with half the offspring surviving to reproduce, doubles the population every few years. Within 10,000 years, which is nothing in geological time, a surviving population of a few thousand birds could theoretically become millions. The recovery is not instantaneous, but it is, by the standards of the deep past, surprisingly fast. So, who survived? Summarizing what the fossil evidence and ecological modeling suggests, the survivors were small. They were ground-associated. They were generalists in their diet. They lived near fresh water. They had fast reproductive cycles. They could tolerate cold conditions better than the dominant warm-weather species of the Cretaceous. And they were, in ways we are still working to quantify, lucky, in the right place at the right time. In a valley that didn't burn, by a river that didn't flood catastrophically, on a hillside where seeds were preserved in sufficient quantities to sustain a small population through the worst of the nuclear winter. The luck cannot be discounted, we should be honest about that. For every lineage that survived, there were certainly many that came equally close and did not make it, populations reduced to the last individual and then below the minimum viable population size, and then gone, removed from the story not by any inadequacy, but by the simple fact that the catastrophe was larger than any evolutionary preparation could reliably protect against. The birds that made it through were the ones that happened to have the right set of traits at the right moment in a world that had been remade overnight. That combination of traits and timing and proximity to the right resources is what we call, in retrospect, survival. In the moment, it would have looked like something much simpler and much more desperate than that. Let that simplicity be what you carry into sleep. Not the scale of the catastrophe, but the particular smallness of the survival. A bird on the ground in a cold and dark world, finding a seed in the leaf litter, eating it, surviving another day, not because it was destined to, or because it was the fittest thing alive, but simply because it was there and it was doing what it knew how to do, and the world had not yet given it a reason to stop. That is the beginning of the next 66 million years. Small, patient, persistent, alive. Let the image settle into something soft and warm as your own breathing slows. The bird is eating the seed. The seed has been waiting in the dark soil for weeks. Everything is cold and quiet, and something is still alive. There is a thin clay layer that exists everywhere on Earth. Not everywhere in the sense that you can go out with a shovel and find it in your garden, but everywhere in the sense that wherever geologists look, in rocks of the right age, on every continent and in cores drilled from the deep sea floor, this layer appears. It is a few centimeters thick. It is slightly different in color from the rocks above and below it, and it contains, in concentrations far higher than normal rock, the element iridium. Iridium is rare on Earth's surface because it sank to the planet's core early in Earth's formation, but it is abundant in asteroids and in the extraterrestrial material that falls to Earth. The thin clay layer is the KPG boundary, the marker of the mass extinction, the physical remains of the asteroid and all that it vaporized spread across the entire planet by the force of the impact and the circulation of the atmosphere. It is visible, you can find it. It is the precise seam between two worlds. Below the boundary layer, there are bird fossils, or rather, there are the fossils of birds and bird relatives and feathered dinosaurs of many kinds, a diverse and complex assemblage representing tens of millions of years of avian evolution. Above the boundary layer, in the rock deposited after the extinction, there are also bird fossils, but the fossils above the layer are strikingly different from the fossils below it. Many of the lineages present in the Cretaceous rocks are simply absent in the Paleocene rocks above. Their story ends at the clay. And the lineages present in the Paleocene, those that would eventually give rise to all modern birds, appear for the first time in the record within a geologically brief interval above the clay layer. They did not come from nowhere. They were there below the clay as well, among the many lineages, but they are the ones that came through. What did the surviving birds look like? This is a question that paleontology has been working on for decades, and the picture is becoming clearer, though it remains incomplete. The earliest confirmed birds above the KPG boundary, the ones whose fossils appear in rock dated to just a few 100,000 years after the impact, were small. They were ground-associated in their habits, as evidenced by the types of sediment in which their fossils are found and the features of their feet and beaks. They were probably not spectacular flyers. They had short, rounded wings and strong legs, the anatomy of a creature that spends more time walking than soaring, more time foraging in undergrowth than hunting in open sky. They were, in short, exactly the kind of bird you would predict to find if you knew that ground-dwelling generalists were the survivors. Here is something that very few people outside of specialized paleontology know, something that was only confirmed by research in the 21st century. The genetic analysis of modern birds, combined with the fossil evidence, suggests that the common ancestor of all living birds, the single species or small closely related group from which every modern bird ultimately descends, was almost certainly a species that could not fly well or could not fly at all during at least part of its life cycle. Perhaps it had chicks that were ground-bound for much longer than modern chicks. Perhaps the adults themselves spent most of their time on the ground. This is counterintuitive. Birds are defined in most people's minds by flight. But the evolutionary bottleneck of the KPG extinction appears to have pushed the ancestral birds through a ground-dwelling phase, and the entire subsequent diversification of modern birds, including all the extraordinary flyers, the albatrosses and swifts and falcons and hummingbirds, springs from that ground-dwelling ancestor. The parrots and the relatives of modern waterfowl, the ducks and geese and their kin, are among the most ancient of the surviving bird lineages. This too is something that only careful genetic analysis has made clear. When scientists construct family trees of modern birds using DNA sequences, they find that these groups diverge from the main bird lineage very early, perhaps within the first few million years after the extinction. This suggests that the ancestor of all modern birds diverged relatively quickly into the first major lineage splits, and that parrots and waterfowl represent some of the oldest branches on the tree. It is a strange thought that the cockatoo and the mallard are in some sense the most ancient of our modern birds, the ones whose lineages go back furthest toward that ground-dwelling survivor of the asteroid winter. And here is a fact that belongs in the category of things that seem almost too strange to be real but are fully verified by the evidence. Modern birds have teeth. Not visible teeth, not teeth you would see if you looked in a bird's mouth, but the genetic instructions for building teeth are present in the DNA of every modern bird species that has been examined. The genes are there, intact, complete, capable in principle of directing the development of enamel-coated teeth in the jawbones of a bird embryo. They are simply switched off. Something in the regulatory network that controls which genes are expressed during embryonic development has silenced the tooth-building genes, and so modern birds develop without teeth. But the instructions remain. A molecular memory of a time before the extinction, a time when the ancestors of modern birds still had teeth in their beaks and were still, in that one visible way, clearly recognizable as descendants of toothed theropod dinosaurs. The loss of teeth in birds is associated with the KPG boundary, or at least with the period immediately after it. The surviving bird lineages appear to have lost functional teeth relatively rapidly after the extinction, probably within the first few million years of the Paleocene. Why? One hypothesis is that toothless beaks were more developmentally flexible, able to evolve into a wider range of shapes for different foods more quickly than toothed jaws. In a world where food sources were unpredictable and diverse, this flexibility would have been extremely valuable. A bird that lost its teeth gained a beak that could be reshaped by evolution relatively quickly, producing the extraordinary diversity of beak morphologies we see in modern birds, from the delicate forceps of a warbler to the massive seed-cracking bill of a macaw to the filtering apparatus of a flamingo. The first few 100,000 years after the extinction in the early Paleocene were not easy years. The darkness had lifted somewhat, but the world was still damaged, still in the process of finding a new equilibrium. Global temperatures were fluctuating. The forests were in the early stages of recovery. The large herbivores were gone, and the ecosystems they had structured, the grasslands they had maintained, the trees they had kept in check, were changing without them. It was a world of transitional states, of temporary vegetation and shifting food sources and ecological roles that had not yet been filled by any particular species. And in this transitional world, the surviving birds thrived, not in the sense of abundance, not in the sense of great diversity, but in the sense of filling space. When you remove 75% of the species from an ecosystem, you leave ecological roles vacant. Every vacant role is a resource that is not being consumed by anything, a niche that is not being occupied. And the surviving birds, small and adaptable and capable of reproducing quickly, began to move into those vacant roles, not deliberately, not strategically, but by the simple mechanism of evolution. The individuals that happened to have slight variations in beak shape or body size or feeding behavior that made them slightly better at exploiting some available resource left slightly more offspring, and those offspring inherited the variation, and over thousands of generations the variation became the norm. There is a question embedded here that might keep you awake if you let it, so we should answer it gently before it can trouble your rest. How do we know all of this? How can we say with confidence that the common ancestor of all birds was a ground dweller, that the parrots and ducks are the most ancient lineages, that the tooth genes are still present in bird DNA? The answer is a combination of three kinds of evidence. The fossil record provides the physical remains of ancient birds, preserved in stone, giving us direct evidence of what existed when. The genomic record, the DNA sequences of modern species, provides a molecular clock that can be read backward to estimate when lineages diverged. And the ecological modeling, using our understanding of how ecosystems work and what traits help animals survive catastrophe, allows us to test hypotheses about why some lineages made it and others did not. All three lines of evidence point in the same direction. All three tell the same story. The first bird fossil confirmed to be from above the KPG boundary, the first physical evidence of a bird living in the post-extinction world, appears in rock dated to approximately 300,000 years after the impact. This is a remarkably short interval in geological terms. 300,000 years is less than the duration of modern human prehistory. By 300,000 years after the extinction, birds were already there, already present in the fossil record, already moving through a world that was still in the early stages of rebuilding itself after the catastrophe. This is the speed of recovery when the survivors are generalists with fast reproductive cycles, not instant, but not the slow crawl of geological time either. A bird, a real post-extinction bird, perched on a branch in the early Paleocene, 300,000 years after the darkness fell. What did it eat? In the early Paleocene, the options were limited. Seeds, certainly. Insects, in the form of the hardy groups that had survived the extinction. Small invertebrates in the soil and underbark. Perhaps fish for the ones that lived near water. Perhaps the eggs of other animals. Perhaps in extremity, carrion. The early Paleocene was not a world of abundance, and the birds that lived in it were not birds of abundance. They were birds of sufficiency, eating enough to survive and reproduce, moving between food sources as availability shifted, building populations slowly and steadily in a world that was still finding its way back to something that could be called productive. The ash. The literal ash from the fires that had burned for months after the impact was, in the early Paleocene, still present in the soil everywhere. A layer of fine grey ash mixed with the KPG boundary clay visible in the sediment, coating the surfaces where new plants were beginning their first tentative growth. The birds that moved through this world moved through a landscape of grey soil and small, low-growing pioneer plants and the black stumps of Cretaceous trees. It would have been a quiet, muted landscape, reduced in colour from the lush greens and browns of the Cretaceous forest, reduced in sound from the rich chorus of a fully developed ecosystem, but not silent, never entirely silent, because something was always eating something else, and something was always singing, however quietly, to mark the fact that it was still there. The feathers themselves are worth considering for a moment. Feathers are extraordinary structures. They are among the most complex things that biological systems have produced, hierarchically branched from a central shaft with interlocking barbules that create a smooth aerodynamic surface with the ability to be preened back into perfect condition after being disturbed. They provide insulation, waterproofing, aerodynamic lift, and the capacity for display all in the same structure. In the cold of the nuclear winter and the uncertain temperatures of the early Paleocene, their insulating function was critical. The ability to maintain body temperature independently of the environment which feathers facilitate was one of the reasons the birds could be active in cold conditions that left cold-blooded animals immobile. There is a particular image from the early Paleocene that I want to offer you for your sleep. A bird, small, brown-feathered, sitting at the edge of a shallow pool in the grey morning light. The pool is surrounded by low ferns, the first ferns to have recolonized this particular area after the fires. The bird is doing what birds do in the morning, preening, running its beak through its feathers to restore the interlocking barbules that had been disturbed in the night, checking each primary flight feather, running them through smoothly until the feather is straight and ordered and perfectly functional again. It is not a dramatic moment. It is the most ordinary thing a bird can do. But in the context of what has just happened, in the context of 66 million years of catastrophe and survival and recovery, it is also the most extraordinary thing imaginable. A bird preening in the morning in the new world after everything. Let that image carry you down. The bird at the pool, preening in the early morning light, in a world that is beginning, very slowly, to grow back. The ferns around the pool. The grey sky brightening toward the east, though not yet with the full brilliance that will eventually return to this world, brighter than before the impact. as the volcanic carbon dioxide pushes global temperatures upward into a new warm age, but bright enough for photosynthesis, bright enough for foraging, bright enough to see the seed at the edge of the water and the insect on the bark of the fallen tree, bright enough to be alive in, to continue in, to begin again in. The bird finishes preening. It ruffles its feathers once, settling them back into place. Then it hops forward toward the water and begins. And this is a good place to pause. There is more story ahead, much more. The 66 million years of diversification and expansion and change that transformed the survivors of the Cretaceous into the 10,000 species alive today. But the foundation of that story is here, in the grey morning of the early Paleocene, in the small bird at the pool, in the persistence that survived the worst thing the planet had experienced in 66 million years and came out the other side still moving, still finding seeds, still preening its feathers in the morning. The rest of the story is an elaboration of that persistence, a flowering of that patience, an exploration of what happens when you give something that will not stop adapting and diversifying 66 million years to work with. If you are drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. And if you are still here, still listening, still riding the edge of wakefulness and sleep, then stay. The story continues, and what comes next? The long, strange, extraordinary story of what happened when the survivors began to inherit a world remade is worth the time it takes to tell. The darkness is lifting. The world is growing back. And the birds, the little feathered survivors with their ground foraging habits and their generalist diets and their stubborn, patient aliveness, are beginning to move into a world that has no precedent in the history of life. Come with us. The Paleocene epoch began 66 million years ago and lasted approximately 10 million years, and for the purposes of understanding what happened after the extinction, those 10 million years are among the most important in the history of life on Earth. Not because they were dramatic, though some of what happened in them was remarkable, but because they were the foundation. They were the time during which the survivors of the catastrophe, working with the genetic material they had carried through the extinction and the ecological opportunities created by all the empty niches, began to build the structure of the modern world. The Paleocene is the quiet time between the catastrophe and the flourishing, the silence between the end of one world and the beginning of the next. The first thing you notice about the early Paleocene landscape, if you imagine yourself there, is what is absent. The large animals are gone. Not reduced, not present in smaller numbers, but absent in a way that changes the fundamental character of the landscape. In the Cretaceous, the large herbivores had shaped the vegetation as much as any other force. The hadrosaurs had kept the undergrowth open in some areas by their constant grazing, creating a mosaic of dense forest and open ground. The ceratopsians had maintained clearings. The movements of large animals through the landscape had created trails and openings and disturbances that formed their own ecological niches. All of this is gone. The vegetation, freed from the pressure of large browsers for the first time in tens of millions of years, grows back in a different pattern. The plants that come back first are not the plants that had dominated the Cretaceous forests. This is one of the most important and least celebrated facts about the post-extinction world. The Cretaceous forests had been dominated by angiosperms, flowering plants that had been diversifying rapidly through the late Cretaceous and were establishing themselves as the dominant form of plant life on land. These angiosperms, when they returned after the extinction, were a different assemblage than before. Many species went extinct. But the most dramatic feature of the earliest Paleocene plant record is the abundance of ferns. Geologists and paleobotanists call it the fern spike. In the sediment layers immediately above the KPG boundary, the pollen and spore record shows an extraordinary increase in fern spores, sometimes to the near exclusion of everything else. For a period that may have lasted from a few thousand to a few tens of thousands of years, ferns were the dominant plants on Earth. This is not random. Ferns are among the most resilient plants on the planet. They can grow from spores, which are even more durable than seeds. They can establish in disturbed soil with no organic matter. They can grow in low-light conditions. When the fires burned and the forests died, and the nuclear winter reduced the available light to a fraction of its normal value, ferns were the plants that could still find enough light to grow. They carpeted the world before anything else could establish itself. The fern spike lasted, depending on location, anywhere from a few thousand to perhaps 30 or 40,000 years. After it, the more complex flowering plants began to return, pioneering species first, the ecological equivalent of the first plants to colonize a fresh volcanic island, small and fast-growing and capable of establishing in bare ground without the need for a complex soil ecosystem to support them. These pioneer plants were followed by slower-growing, more resource-demanding species, and those were followed by others, and the succession of plant communities in the early Paleocene was a slow rebuilding of ecological complexity from the ground up, from the simplest possible biological community towards something that could, in time, be called a forest. And through all of this, the birds were present. They were not spectators. They were active participants in the recovery in ways that mattered enormously for what the recovery eventually produced. Seeds. The birds that survived were seed eaters, and seed eaters carry seeds. Modern research on seed dispersal has made clear just how important birds are to the distribution of plant species. A bird that eats a fruit or a seed and then flies 5 kilometers before eliminating the seed in its droppings has moved that plant 5 kilometers without the plant doing anything at all. In a recovering landscape where plants are recolonizing from isolated refugees, the ability of birds to carry seeds across barriers that the plants themselves cannot cross is transformative. The recovery of the Paleocene forests was, in part, a story of birds carrying the seeds of the future world in their digestive tracts. There is another dimension of the early Paleocene that deserves careful attention: the climate. The world that the survivors were rebuilding themselves in was not the same temperature as the world before the impact. The volcanic carbon dioxide released during the impact event, and by the burning of the world's forests, had added a significant pulse of greenhouse gas to the atmosphere. After the nuclear winter lifted and the skies cleared, that carbon dioxide was still there, and it was doing what carbon dioxide does, warming the surface. The early Paleocene was warmer than the Cretaceous had been. Not dramatically, not all at once, but trending warmer, and the warmth would eventually peak in a period about 10 million years after the extinction that geologists call the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, when global temperatures were perhaps 5 to 8 degrees Celsius warmer than they are today. The warmth was, for the recovering world, not entirely unwelcome. Warm temperatures mean abundant plant growth. They mean the expansion of tropical and subtropical conditions into higher latitudes. They mean more moisture in the atmosphere, more rainfall, more of the conditions that support diverse and productive ecosystems. The hot, wet Paleocene and early Eocene that followed the extinction may have been one of the most biologically productive periods in Earth's history. A world where forests covered much of the land, where diversity was increasing rapidly, where the empty niches left by the extinction were being filled at a pace that, by geological standards, was almost explosive. But here is a detail that belongs in this chapter because it is strange and worth dwelling on. Among all the evidence that scientists have gathered about what happened after the extinction, there is a persistent question about whether some non-avian dinosaurs survived the initial catastrophe for longer than is usually acknowledged, not indefinitely, not for millions of years. But there are some fossil sites, a few isolated locations in the American West, that have produced what appear to be non-avian dinosaur teeth and bones in sediment layers dated to slightly above the KPG boundary. The evidence is debated, the dating is difficult, and the mainstream view remains that non-avian dinosaurs went essentially completely extinct at the boundary. But the possibility that some populations in isolated areas survived for thousands or tens of thousands of years after the main extinction event exists. Some triceratops may have grazed in isolated valleys for 100,000 years after most of their kind were gone. Some hadrosaurs may have persisted at the edges of refugia for a geologically brief additional span. We may never know for certain. The silence that the chapter title refers to is not just the absence of large dinosaurs. It is a deeper silence, the silence of an ecosystem that has lost most of its complexity. In a fully developed ecosystem, there is a constant multi-layered sound. The insect chorus, the bird calls, the wind through a dense canopy, the sounds of large animals moving through undergrowth, the splashing of fish, the calls of frogs from every body of water. Even in the most abundant Cretaceous forest, all of these layers were present simultaneously, creating the continuous, dense texture of sound that is the acoustic signature of a healthy, diverse ecosystem. In the early Paleocene, most of these layers were reduced to a fraction of their former presence. The insect chorus was thinner, the bird calls were fewer, The large animal sounds were absent entirely. It was quieter, not silent, but quieter. The quietness of the early Paleocene is in some ways the most evocative aspect of the period. It was a world in the process of healing, a world that had been deeply hurt and was slowly, methodically doing the work of recovery. This kind of healing is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It proceeds through small accumulations of change, each individual change barely perceptible, but the changes compounding over thousands of years into something you can measure and see. A few more plant species, a few more insect species, a few more bird species, filling a few more ecological roles, the food webs becoming gradually more complex, the sounds of the world becoming gradually richer. There is something restful in contemplating this kind of slow healing. It asks nothing of us. It requires no intervention. It simply proceeds, as it always has, at the pace that life's own processes set. The bacteria in the soil doing their work of decomposing the dead and returning nutrients to circulation. The fungi breaking down the last of the fallen Cretaceous timber. The pioneer plants fixing nitrogen in barren soil, making it possible for the next plant in the succession to establish. The birds moving seeds from one place to another. The insects pollinating the pioneer flowers, each small thing doing its particular job, not knowing that its job is part of a larger process, not understanding that the accumulation of all these small things, over thousands of years, will produce something that can be called a forest again. This is also, if you think about it, not entirely unlike the work that a resting body does during sleep. The restoration of tissues, the consolidation of memory, the slow, deep maintenance work that the body and brain do when they are freed from the demands of waking activity. Sleep is, in its own way, a kind of Paleocene, a quiet interval between the activity of the previous day and the activity of the next one, during which essential repairs are made and resources are replenished, and the complex system that is you returns to a state from which it can sustain another day of full engagement with the world. Let your Paleocene come now. Let the slow work begin. The world outside your window has been doing exactly this for 66 million years. The birds of the early Paleocene were not yet the birds we know. They were the rough sketches, the first drafts, the ancestral forms from which all the diversity of modern avian life would eventually spring. Some of them were probably fairly ordinary-looking by Cretaceous standards, small-bodied, ground-associated, with generalist diets and modest capabilities. Others were beginning to experiment, as surviving species always eventually do, with different body sizes and different ecological roles. The fossil record from the early Paleocene is sparse because the conditions for preservation are not always right, and because the animals of this period were often small and their bones delicate. But what we find suggests a world in the early stages of a diversification that would, over the next 66 million years, produce one of the most species-rich vertebrate groups on Earth. The world is quiet tonight. Wherever you are, the large sounds of the day have faded. The traffic, the conversations, the particular noise of whatever your world makes when it is fully active, these have subsided to something lower and more intermittent. What remains is the sound of the night, which is a smaller and more intimate version of the sound of the world. Maybe the occasional car in the distance, the house settling in the way houses do when the air cools. Perhaps, if you are lucky, the sound of something living outside, an insect or a bird or the wind through leaves. These sounds are not nothing. They are the acoustic signature of a living world, a world in the process of its nightly Paleocene, its quiet interval of repair and rest. The early Paleocene lasted 10 million years, and in those 10 million years, the world that came after was being assembled piece by piece, relationship by relationship, species by species. When the Eocene began, 56 million years ago, the world was warm and wet and increasingly diverse, and the birds were no longer the marginal survivors of a catastrophe, but the dominant airborne vertebrates of the planet, filling niches from the deep ocean shores to the mountain summits, from the Arctic coast to the equatorial rainforest. That is where the next chapters of the story will take us. For now, rest in the quiet of the Paleocene. Let the slow work of recovery carry you into sleep. The return of colour to the world after the extinction was not a single event, but an accumulation of small arrivals, each one adding to the palette of the recovering landscape. The ferns that came first were mostly green, a single note held long and low across the damaged world. Then the first flowering pioneer plants appeared, small and low-growing, with tiny blossoms in pale yellows and whites that the surviving insects visited with a diligence that suggests those insects understood, at whatever level insects understand things, that these flowers were precious. Then the first shrubs. Then the first trees, spindly and short at first, growing fast in the warm, wet conditions of the early Paleocene, taking decades to reach anything like the height that Cretaceous trees had reached. Then more trees, then the canopy closing over, shade forming beneath it, and in the shade the plants that required less light beginning to establish. And so the forest came back. It was not the same forest. This is important and worth staying with for a moment. The Cretaceous forest and the Paleocene forest were not the same assemblage of species living through the same ecological relationships. Many of the plant species of the Cretaceous were extinct. The animals that had shaped the Cretaceous vegetation, the large herbivores, were gone. And the evolutionary relationships between plants and animals, which in the Cretaceous had been shaped by tens of millions of years of coevolution, had to be renegotiated from scratch in the New World. Which insects pollinated which plants? Which animals dispersed which seeds? Which predators kept which prey populations in check? All of these relationships were being established anew in a world where many of the old participants were absent and new ones were emerging to take their places. The flowering plants, the angiosperms, came to dominate the Paleocene and Eocene landscapes in ways they had not quite managed even in the late Cretaceous. Part of the reason is that the extinction removed many of the non-flowering plant groups that had been holding their own against the angiosperms in the Cretaceous. The early conifers and cycads and ferns that had occupied significant ecological space in the Mesozoic were reduced by the extinction, and the angiosperms, which had the advantage of flowers and fruits and the complex relationships with pollinators and seed dispersers that these structures created, expanded to fill the space. The Paleocene world was the world in which the flowering plants finally decisively took over, and they have held that dominance ever since. The relationship between birds and flowering plants is one of the most important ecological partnerships in the history of life, and it was forged in exactly this period, in the warming Paleocene and Eocene, as both groups diversified simultaneously into the recovering world. Birds needed what flowers had: nectar, fruits, seeds. Flowers needed what birds provided: pollination and seed dispersal. Each species of plant that evolved a fruit shaped and colored to attract birds was rewarded with a more effective seed dispersal system. Each species of bird that evolved a beak suited to eating a particular kind of fruit was rewarded with a reliable food source. Over millions of years, this mutual dependence produced an extraordinary web of species-specific relationships, many of which persist today. Think about the last time you saw a bird eat a berry. It is such an ordinary thing in the modern world that it hardly seems worth attention. The bird opens its beak, takes the berry, swallows it, moves on. In an hour or a day or a week, the seed inside the berry passes through the bird's digestive system and is deposited intact and viable and fertilized by the waste that accompanies it somewhere else. Somewhere the bird has flown in the intervening time. The plant has moved. The plant has, through the intermediary of the bird, sent its offspring to a new location without any expenditure of its own energy. This seemingly mundane interaction is repeated billions of times every day across the surface of the Earth, and it is the primary mechanism by which flowering plants maintain and expand their ranges, and it is 66 million years old, or very nearly. It began in the recovering world of the early Paleocene, forged from the partnership of the surviving birds and the recovering plants. The mammals were also present in the Paleocene, and their story is inextricably entangled with the story of the birds. Both groups were products of the KPG extinction event, in the sense that the extinction was the thing that opened the ecological space they needed to diversify into. In the Cretaceous, the mammals had been restricted to small body sizes by the competition and predation pressure from dinosaurs. They had spent 60 million years as the small things in the shadow of the large things. When the large things were gone, the small things were suddenly the largest things, and the logic of ecology required that something fill the roles the large things had played. The mammals did not hesitate for long. The first large mammals appeared with remarkable speed after the extinction. Remarkably, recent fossil studies from the San Juan Basin in New Mexico have documented that mammals achieving the body size of a modern sheep appeared within approximately 100,000 years of the KPG extinction. 100,000 years is nothing in geological time. It is shorter than the duration of modern human prehistory, but in that interval, the ecological pressure of empty large-body niches and abundant plant food in the recovering forests drove the evolution of large mammalian herbivores with extraordinary speed. Evolution, we are learning, can move faster than we once thought when the selective pressures are strong enough and the variation available to work with is sufficient. The birds and the early mammals were not in direct competition in most respects because they occupied different ecological roles and different parts of the recovering environment. The birds dominated the aerial space and the canopy as the trees grew tall enough to create canopy. They dominated the seed dispersal and pollination roles, flying between plants and carrying the genetic material of the plant world from place to place. The mammals began to fill the large-body terrestrial herbivore and omnivore roles that had been vacated by the dinosaurs. The two groups coexisted and their relationship was largely complementary rather than competitive. There was one area of competition, and it is worth noting because it would become very important later in the story: the insect-eating niche. Both birds and small mammals eat insects. In the early Paleocene, when insect diversity was still recovering from the extinction, this niche was both important and limiting. The small mammals that would eventually give rise to the insectivore order, creatures like the ancestors of modern shrews and hedgehogs, were competing with small insectivorous birds for the same food resources. The outcome of this competition in the early Paleocene was mixed, with both groups surviving, but the pressure may have been one of the forces that drove some early birds away from insectivory and toward the seed-eating and fruit-eating strategies that would eventually become dominant in the bird world. The oceans, meanwhile, were undergoing their own recovery, and the story of marine ecosystem recovery after the KPG extinction is as important as the terrestrial recovery for understanding the world that eventually emerged. The marine extinctions had been severe. The ammonites, those beautifully coiled cephalopods that had been among the most diverse and abundant marine animals for hundreds of millions of years, went completely extinct at the KPG boundary. The mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, the large marine reptiles that had dominated the open ocean, were gone. Many species of fish were gone. The marine food webs had been disrupted as thoroughly as the terrestrial ones. But the oceans recovered, and they recovered in ways that ultimately benefited the birds. As marine ecosystems rebuilt themselves over the Paleocene and Eocene, they produced the fish-rich, invertebrate-rich, productive marine environments that supported the diversification of seabirds. The ancestors of modern penguins, albatrosses, petrels, gannets, cormorants, and shorebirds were all evolving in response to the recovering marine food webs of the Paleocene and Eocene. The ocean was opening up as an ecological space, and the birds were the group that had the physical adaptations, the warm blood and the waterproof feathers and the swimming and diving capabilities to exploit it most effectively. There is something deeply reassuring about the pattern of recovery that you see across all the different ecosystems of the Paleocene and Eocene. On land, in fresh water, in the oceans, the same basic story plays out with variations in the details. The survivors of the catastrophe, finding themselves in a world of empty niches and abundant resources, diversify, they experiment. They evolve into new forms, trying new ecological strategies, filling new roles. Not all experiments succeed, and the fossil record is full of lineages that diversified in the early Paleocene and then went extinct before reaching the Eocene. But enough succeed, enough lineages find stable ecological roles and persist and continue to evolve. The system rebuilds itself. The green returned. That is the simplest way to say it. The green that had covered the world before the impact, the extraordinary density of plant life that was the Cretaceous forest, returned to the world in the Paleocene and Eocene, changed in composition but not in essential character. Forests grew, rivers ran clear and full through forested landscapes. The soil, enriched by 66 million years of accumulated organic matter and the diverse soil fauna that decomposed it, became richer and more productive than the Cretaceous soil had been. And in these recovering forests, the birds diversified in ways that have no parallel in the previous history of the group. The diversity, this is where the story begins to become almost incomprehensible in its richness. The birds that exist today, the 10,000 species filling every ecological role from tiny nectar-feeding hummingbirds to massive flightless cassowaries, from deep-diving penguins to thermal-soaring condors with wingspans of 3 meters. All of this diversity springs from the diversification that began in the Paleocene and accelerated through the Eocene and continued through every epoch since. The ancestral birds of the early Paleocene were not this diverse, but they had the genetic raw material, the evolutionary flexibility, the physical adaptability that made this diversity possible. They were the seed from which 66 million years of flowering would spring. Let the image of the returning green settle into your rest now. The forest growing back, the canopy closing over, the shade beneath the canopy filling with the plants that need shade, and the insects that need those plants, and the birds that need those insects. Layer upon layer of ecological relationship rebuilding itself in the warm, wet Paleocene world. The birds moving through it, eating and singing and nesting and dispersing seeds and pollinating flowers and doing all the things that birds do in a world that is ready for them, the world ready for them. The world, for the first time in its history, organized around the diversification of birds as one of its central ecological facts. Rest in the green. Let it grow around you as you sleep. Something to carry into the quiet of your night. The world outside your window, whatever corner of the world you inhabit, is the product of 66 million years of recovery and diversification after a catastrophe that reshaped life on Earth. The trees outside your window, if there are trees, descended from the pioneer angiosperms of the Paleocene. The birds outside your window, if there are birds, descended from the survivors of the KPG extinction. The insects and the mammals and the fish in the nearby water all trace their current forms back to lineages that came through that event and rebuilt the world in the aftermath. You are living in the Paleocene's product. You are living in the world that recovery built. And it is, despite everything, a beautiful world. Rest in it now. 56 million years ago, the world reached a warmth that it would not achieve again for millions of years. And that warmth, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, was one of the most extraordinary events in the history of life since the extinction itself. Global temperatures were 5 to 8 degrees Celsius warmer than they are today. The Arctic, where today there is permanent ice, was forested. Subtropical forests grew in what is now southern Canada. The tropics, already warm, were warmer still, perhaps too warm in places for some of the species that had evolved there during the cooler recovery period. Sea levels were higher. The continental shelves that are now dry land were underwater. The world was, in its broadest outlines, more uniformly warm and wet and forested than it has been at any time since. And in that warm, wet, forested world, the birds were singing. Not all birds sing. Not in the technical sense that ornithologists use when they distinguish between songs and calls, but in the Eocene, the group of birds we now call the songbirds, the Oscine passerines, began their own diversification, and the ability to produce complex, learned vocalizations began to emerge as one of the defining characteristics of the most diverse group of birds that has ever existed. Songbirds today represent more than half of all living bird species. They are everywhere. They fill the urban spaces and the wild forests and the agricultural lands. Their diversity is staggering, ranging from the crow family, among the most intelligent of all birds, to the tiny wrens and warblers that fill the understory with intricate sound. All of this diversity traces back to the Eocene, to the warm world after the recovery. Song is a technology. That is a useful way to think about it, though it may initially seem to reduce something beautiful to something mechanical. In evolutionary terms, song is a communication technology that allows birds to convey complex information over long distances without being seen. A singing bird can establish a territory, attract a mate, warn rivals, and coordinate with a partner while remaining hidden in dense vegetation. For animals living in forest environments where visibility is limited and sound travels well, this is an extraordinarily effective strategy. The evolution of complex vocal learning in birds, the ability to learn and modify songs rather than simply producing fixed genetically determined calls, gave the songbird lineage a flexibility that proved tremendously advantageous in the diversifying world of the Eocene. The Eocene forests of the Northern Hemisphere are particularly important to understand because they were the crucible in which so many modern bird groups diversified. These were not forests like the tropical rainforests of today. They were warmer and more diverse, mixing tree species from groups we now associate with the tropics with tree species we now associate with temperate zones. There were no frozen winters in these forests, even at latitudes that today experience months of snow and darkness. Year-round warmth meant year-round productivity, which meant abundant food for birds throughout the year, which meant that populations could maintain themselves without the need for seasonal migration. The Eocene birds were largely non-migratory in the modern sense. They lived in one place, in one continuous forest that extended from tropical latitudes to what would later become the far north. The respiratory system that the birds carried into this world deserves a moment of explanation because it is one of the facts about birds that most clearly marks their dinosaur heritage, and most people are not aware of it. Birds breathe in a way that no other living animal breathes. They have a system of air sacs connected to their lungs that allows air to flow through the respiratory system in one direction only, rather than in and out of the same passage the way mammalian lungs work. This flow-through system means that the blood in a bird's lung is always in contact with fresh, oxygenated air rather than a mixture of fresh air and spent air as happens in mammalian lungs. The result is that birds can extract oxygen from the air more efficiently than mammals can, which is why birds can fly at altitudes where mammals cannot function, and why a hummingbird can sustain wing beat rates of more than 50 times per second without respiratory failure. This respiratory system did not evolve in birds, it evolved in dinosaurs. Specifically, it evolved in the theropod dinosaurs, the group from which birds descended, over a period beginning perhaps 240 million years ago. Air sacs have been identified in fossil theropods through the analysis of their bones, which show the characteristic hollow chambers and openings that indicate the presence of air sacs in life. The same bone structures that identify a fossil theropod as a member of the bird's ancestral lineage are still present in every modern bird, scaled down to match the bird's smaller body. When a sparrow takes a breath, the air moves through its body in exactly the same way it moved through the body of a velociraptor. The breathing of birds is the breathing of the Mesozoic, carried forward into the world of today. There is another fact about bird physiology that is less often remarked on and yet is equally striking. Birds have four-chambered hearts, so do mammals. Four-chambered hearts are the most efficient cardiovascular design for warm-blooded animals that maintain consistently high activity levels because they completely separate the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood circuits, allowing the maximum efficiency of oxygen delivery to the tissues. Mammals and birds both need four-chambered hearts for the same reason. They are both highly active, warm-blooded animals with high metabolic rates, but they did not inherit their four-chambered hearts from a common ancestor. They evolved independently. The common ancestor of birds and mammals was a cold-blooded animal with a simpler, less efficient heart, and the four-chambered heart design was arrived at separately, along independent evolutionary pathways by two groups that faced the same physiological challenge and found the same solution. The Eocene diversification of birds produced forms that we would recognize today and forms that we would not. The passerines, the perching birds, were diversifying. The raptors, the hawks and eagles and their relatives were establishing themselves as the dominant aerial predators of the recovering world. The shorebirds and wading birds were spreading along the coastlines and wetlands. The parrots, already ancient as a lineage by the Eocene, were diversifying in the warm forests of the southern hemisphere. The ducks and geese were exploring the freshwater and coastal marine environments. The herons and storks were establishing in the wetland environments that the warm, wet Eocene provided abundantly. One lineage that deserves particular attention in the context of the Eocene is the group of birds that would eventually give rise to songbirds, the Oscines. The earliest Oscines appear in the fossil record in Australia and the surrounding region, which in the Eocene was positioned at a different latitude than it is today, but was already developing the distinctive ecological character that would eventually produce the most bird-diverse continent on Earth relative to its size. The ancestor of all songbirds was probably something like a small, insectivorous, ground-foraging bird in the forests of what is now Australia. From that ancestor, over the next 30 million years, would spring the most diverse bird group in history. The Eocene was also the time when the seabirds established themselves in forms that are recognizable as the ancestors of modern groups. The Eocene oceans were warming, and the warming oceans were productive in ways that cold water oceans often are not. abundant plankton, abundant fish that ate the plankton, abundant squid and crustaceans, and available from the perspective of a warm-blooded animal with waterproof feathers and the ability to swim, to fly, and to pursue prey in 3 dimensions. All of this marine abundance was a resource waiting to be exploited. The seabirds exploited it. The ancestors of modern albatrosses, with their extraordinary long wings evolved for effortless gliding across thousands of miles of open ocean, appear in the Eocene fossil record. The ancestors of petrels and shearwaters, the ancestors of gannets and boobies, the plunge divers that strike the water from height to catch fish below the surface. The albatross deserves a moment of attention here because it represents one of the most extraordinary solutions to a physical problem that evolution has ever produced. An albatross can fly 10,000 kilometers between significant wing strokes. Not 10 kilometers, 10,000. It uses a technique called dynamic soaring, exploiting the difference in wind speed between the ocean surface and the air a few meters above it, banking in precise arcs that convert the energy of the wind gradient into forward motion. A wandering albatross can circumnavigate the Southern Ocean in less than 6 weeks, flying continuously, sleeping while airborne in brief intervals, covering the distance that takes a modern ship weeks without consuming the energy that would exhaust a much smaller bird flying in the ordinary flapping way. The ancestors of this extraordinary animal were present in the Eocene oceans, already beginning the exploration of oceanic soaring that would culminate in the most efficient flying machine the world has ever produced. As the Eocene progressed, the birds were becoming increasingly diverse in their behaviors as well as their physical forms. Nesting strategies were diversifying. Some birds were developing the complex colonial nesting behaviors that characterize modern seabirds, gathering in thousands on cliff faces and islands to breed. Others were developing the extraordinarily complex nest architectures of modern weaverbirds and bowerbirds, using materials from the environment to create structures of remarkable precision. The relationship between birds and the materials of their environment, the ability to perceive and manipulate objects in service of nesting or feeding, was laying the groundwork for the more elaborate cognitive abilities that would eventually characterize the corvid family. The cognitive abilities of birds in general were developing through this period in ways that are only now being appreciated. For a long time, the study of animal intelligence focused almost exclusively on mammals, particularly primates, and the phrase bird-brained was used as a term of mild insult, implying simple or poor cognition. The reality turns out to be more interesting. Bird brains are organized differently from mammalian brains, and for a long time this different organization was misinterpreted as indicating less capability. But birds with relatively small brains, judged by the mammalian standard of brain-to-body ratio, turn out to be capable of remarkably sophisticated cognitive operations when tested appropriately. Tool use, spatial memory, the ability to plan for the future, social learning of complex behaviors, all of these have been documented in birds, and the ancestors of the most capable modern birds were diversifying in exactly the cognitive directions that would eventually produce these capabilities in the Eocene world. There is a sound that the Eocene world made that was different from any sound the Earth had made before. It was the sound of a planet where songbirds were present, filling the forests with complex, learned, variable vocalizations produced by animals that could modify their songs in response to the songs of others. Not the fixed calls of insects or the simple territorial calls of reptiles. Not even the relatively simple vocalizations of the non-passerine birds, but something more elaborate, more variable, more responsive to context and social environment. The Eocene forest, in its early phase of songbird diversification, was developing an acoustic complexity that the world had not previously known. And that acoustic complexity, those layers of sound moving through the forest at dawn, is the direct ancestor of what you can hear if you open your window on a spring morning in almost any part of the world. Let the sound of it drift toward you now. The Eocene dawn chorus, building from the first tentative calls before the light has fully come to the full-throated complexity of mid-morning. Dozens of species producing dozens of different vocalizations, each one learned, each one capable of variation, each one carrying information about the identity and condition and territorial claims of its producer. It is a rich sound, layered and complex, and it has been building for 50 million years on the basis laid by the survivors of the asteroid winter. Listen to it softly in your imagination as your own breathing slows and your thoughts grow quiet. The birds are singing, They have been singing since the Eocene. They will be singing tomorrow morning, outside your window, in the same tradition. Let the sound carry you the rest of the way down. If you are drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. There is more ahead, some of the strangest and most remarkable chapters in this long story. The reign of the terror birds, the rise of the mammals, the spreading of wings across a world that was growing more like our own with each million years that passed. If you are still here, still at the comfortable edge between waking and sleep, come with us a little further. The story is worth the journey. There is a story within the larger story that deserves its own chapter, and it is one of the stranger and less familiar chapters in the long history of the birds. To understand it, you need to know something about the geography of the Eocene and Oligocene world that most people do not learn in school. South America, in those epochs, was an island. Not a small island, not a medium island, but an island continent, separated from North America by a stretch of ocean that would not close until about 3 million years ago, when the Isthmus of Panama rose from the sea and connected the two continents. For approximately 60 million years, South America evolved in magnificent isolation, its plants and animals developing along lines that had no equivalent anywhere else on Earth. And the dominant large predators of that isolated continent were birds. Not birds as you normally think of birds. Not the small, delicate seed-eating or insect-eating birds that fill the parks and gardens of the modern world, birds that stood 3 meters tall at the shoulder, birds whose hooked beaks were larger than the head of a modern horse, birds that could run at 50 kilometers per hour across the grasslands of South America without breaking the rhythm of their stride. These were the Phorus racidae, known more informally as the terror birds, and they were the apex predators of South America for approximately 50 million years. From the Eocene, when the first of the lineage appeared in the fossil record, to the Pleistocene, when the last of them vanished about 2 million years ago, the terror birds ruled. They were the most dominant avian predators in the history of the world, and their story is one of the most dramatic in the long history of the survivors of the asteroid. The terror birds descended from the same general avian stock as the other survivors of the KPG extinction. They did not arrive in South America from somewhere else. They evolved there, in the isolation of the island continent, freed from the competition of the placental mammal carnivores that were diversifying on the northern continents. In the absence of mammalian competition for the large predator niche, the birds filled it. And they filled it with an efficiency and a commitment that resulted in some of the most formidable predators the world has ever seen, constructed not from mammalian muscle and claw, but from bone and feather and beak, and the astonishing power of a running biped that had traded its forearms for wings. To understand how a bird becomes an apex predator of large prey, it helps to understand what the terror bird's hunting style actually looked like. Modern birds that hunt large prey, like the golden eagle or the martial eagle of Africa, use their talons as their primary killing tools, gripping and puncturing with the power of their leg muscles, which in raptors are enormously developed relative to their body size. The terror birds had different anatomy. Their legs were long and powerful, built for speed rather than gripping, and their killing tool was their beak. The beak of a large terror bird was enormous, hooked at the tip in the manner of an eagle's beak but on a scale that beggars comparison. It was capable, research has suggested, of delivering a downward strike with the force of a small car impacting at moderate speed. The hunting strategy of the terror birds appears to have involved pursuit, speed, and a specific type of strike. A terror bird pursuing prey across the open grasslands of Eocene and Oligocene South America was probably using its speed to close distance, then delivering precise, powerful strikes with its beak to stun or kill the prey. The three-toed feet were not primarily gripping tools, but running tools, capable of the sustained speed necessary to catch the fast-moving ground mammals that were the likely primary prey. The combination of speed and beak power made them genuinely terrifying predators, and their success over 50 million years across an entire continent is testimony to the effectiveness of this strategy. The largest of the terror birds, a genus called Kelenken, which lived approximately 15 million years ago in what is now Argentina, had a skull nearly 72 centimeters long, making it the largest known skull of any bird that has ever lived. The skull is so large, so imposing in the fossil record, that the first researchers to examine it in the early 20th century initially classified it as belonging to a terrestrial crocodilian. It took careful analysis to establish that the creature had been a bird, and a specific kind of bird, descended from the survivors of the asteroid winter, a direct descendant of the small, ground-foraging birds that had made it through the darkest period in the history of complex life. There is something philosophically striking about this lineage if you let yourself sit with it for a moment. The asteroid hit, the skies went dark, the plants died, and the birds that survived, the small, ground-dwelling, seed-eating birds that made it through by being flexible and small and patient, eventually gave rise, in the isolation of a continent separated from the rest of the world, to creatures 3 meters tall that were the most feared predators of an entire hemisphere. The survivors of the catastrophe in the warm isolation of an island continent explored every ecological possibility that their bodies could reach, and one of the possibilities they reached was this: enormous, swift and lethal, the terror of the open grasslands, the birds that had no equals in South America for 50 million years. But the terror birds are not the most numerous or the most successful avian lineage in the story of the survivors. They are the most dramatic, the most striking, the easiest to imagine as descendants of the terrible lizards of the Mesozoic. But the birds that dominated South America's open skies and forests, while the terror birds stalked the grasslands, were more ordinary looking, more familiar, and in some ways more important for the eventual outcome of the story. The parrots of South America, the tanagers and hummingbirds, the antibirds and ovenbirds and woodcreepers, the extraordinary diversity of neotropical songbirds that make South America today the most bird-diverse region on Earth. These were the birds that were filling the vegetated world while the terror birds occupied the predator niche, diversifying quietly and thoroughly into the rich ecological space of the isolated continent. The hummingbirds in particular are a wonder that deserves attention in this chapter, because they represent one of the most extreme physiological solutions to a specific ecological problem that evolution has ever produced. They are tiny, the smallest of all birds, weighing in some species as little as 2 grams. They have metabolic rates so high that they would exhaust their fuel reserves within hours if they could not find nectar continuously. Their heart rates can exceed 1,200 beats per minute during flight. They are the only birds capable of sustained hovering flight, holding a fixed position in the air by beating their wings in a figure-8 pattern at 50 or more strokes per second. And they have, through millions of years of coevolution with flowering plants, become so tightly linked to specific flowers that some species and their preferred flower species have evolved beak and blossom shapes that fit together with the precision of a lock and a key. The hummingbirds diversified in South America during the period when the terror birds were ruling the grasslands, and they did so in close partnership with the extraordinary diversity of South American flowering plants. Both groups, the birds and the flowers, drove each other's diversification. A flower that evolved a shape only hummingbirds could access gained an exclusive pollinator. A hummingbird that evolved a beak suited to a particular flower gained an exclusive food source. These exclusive partnerships, repeated hundreds of times with hundreds of different species pairs, produced the extraordinary diversity of both hummingbirds and flowering plants that characterizes the neotropical region today. It is one of the most complex and beautiful examples of coevolution in the history of life. The terror bird's end came about 3 million years ago, when the geological processes that had been slowly lifting the sea floor at the narrow point of Central America finally succeeded in connecting North and South America with a land bridge. The Isthmus of Panama rose from the sea, and what followed is known to ecologists as the Great American Biotic Interchange, one of the most dramatic natural experiments in biogeography that the Earth has ever run. North American mammals flooded south across the new land bridge, and South American animals, including terror birds, moved north. The interchange introduced large mammalian predators, saber-toothed cats and wolves, to the South American grasslands for the first time. These mammalian carnivores competed directly with the terror birds for prey, and the terror birds, which had spent 50 million years as the unchallenged apex predators, found themselves in direct competition with an equally effective but differently equipped group of hunters. The last terror birds went extinct approximately 2 million years ago. A few specimens from North America, found in sediment from about 2.5 million years ago, represent the northernmost range of the group before their final disappearance. They lasted for 2 million years after the Great American Interchange, which is itself testimony to their effectiveness as predators. But eventually, they were gone. The 50-million-year reign of the terror birds, the most dramatic of all the evolutionary experiments carried out by the survivors of the asteroid, came to a quiet end in the Pleistocene, their place in the South American ecosystem taken by the mammalian predators that had crossed the new land bridge. Today, in the grasslands where the terror birds once ran at 50 kilometers per hour, there are rheas, large, flightless birds, related to ostriches and emus, occupying the open grassland niche that their distant and more imposing relatives once dominated. They are not predators. They are grazers, large herbivorous birds that live in flocks and use their size and speed as defense rather than as offense. They are the terror birds' peaceful successors in the open spaces of South America, occupying a different ecological role but maintaining a certain physical grandeur that recalls the scale of what came before. When you see a rhea, you are seeing something that lives in the same spaces and runs on the same earth as the terror birds once ruled. There is a larger pattern that the terror birds illustrate, one that recurs throughout the story of the survivors and their descendants. The pattern is this: given time and the right conditions, the survivors of a catastrophe do not simply return to what they were before. They explore the full range of possibilities that their inherited biology makes available to them, finding ecological roles that no member of their lineage had previously occupied, evolving into forms that would have been unrecognizable to their ancestors. The ground-foraging bird that survived the asteroid winter could not have given rise to a terror bird in one step. It took tens of millions of years of gradual change, each generation differing slightly from the last, the lineage drifting under the pressure of the environment toward larger size and greater predatory specialization. And what this means, in the deepest sense, is that the survivors of the asteroid winter were not carrying forward a fixed destiny. They were carrying forward a potential, the potential to be birds in all the extraordinary diversity that the word eventually came to encompass. The potential to fill every ecological role that could be filled by an animal with feathers and warm blood and hollow bones and a beak. The terror birds filled one set of those roles. The hummingbirds filled another. The albatrosses and the crows and the penguins and the ostriches all filled others. None of this was determined in advance. All of it was explored over millions of years by the descendants of the small survivors, branching and diversifying and finding their way into every available space in the living world. Let the terror birds walk softly through your imagination now as you descend towards sleep. They are not frightening in this context. They are remarkable. 3 meters tall, their feathers not the brilliant plumage of a toucan or the subtle barred pattern of a hawk, but something simpler, darker, the feathers of a ground-dwelling runner, functional rather than ornamental. They move across an Eocene grassland in the long light of afternoon, and the other animals give them space, and the sky above them is full of smaller birds going about their ordinary business, and the world is warm and alive and completely unlike the world that existed before the asteroid, and yet continuous with it, built from the same lineage, the same survival, the same patient, stubborn, extraordinary aliveness. Sleep now, let them walk on. For 60 million years, the mammals had been shadows. That is not a metaphor chosen lightly. From the first true mammals in the late Triassic, approximately 220 million years ago, to the end of the Cretaceous 66 million years ago, the mammals lived in the margins. They were small, mostly nocturnal, mostly insectivorous, mostly unremarkable to a casual observer in a Cretaceous forest who was busy watching the hadrosaurs and the ceratopsians and the feathered theropods. The mammals were not absent from the Cretaceous world. They were present in considerable diversity, with perhaps 200 or more species alive at any given time. But they were constrained. Their maximum body size was roughly that of a modern badger. Their maximum ecological ambition was limited by the competition and predation pressure of a world organized around dinosaurs. They could not be large. They could not be active during the day without significant risk. They could not occupy the ecological roles they were, in terms of their physiology and reproductive strategies, fully capable of filling. The KPG extinction event removed those constraints overnight. geologically speaking. The large dinosaurs that had been limiting mammalian ambitions for 60 million years were gone within a geological instant, and the empty ecological space they left behind was, from a mammalian perspective, an invitation so large and so urgent that evolution responded with a speed that still surprises us when we measure it carefully. The Paleocene was the mammals' moment, and they took it with a thoroughness and speed that sets some kind of record for how quickly a group of organisms can expand into available ecological space. The evidence for this rapid expansion comes from fossil beds in North America, Asia, and Europe, the northern continents where the KPG extinction is most thoroughly documented and where the early Paleocene fauna is most extensively preserved. The pattern is consistent across all of these sites. In the rocks immediately above the KPG boundary, the mammals present are small. They are the small survivors, the insectivores and omnivores of the late Cretaceous, familiar in form and modest in ambition. But within a geological interval that, in some sites, translates to approximately 100,000 years from the boundary, something remarkable has happened. The mammals have gotten big. Not gigantic, not immediately, but big in relative terms, achieving body sizes comparable to a large dog or a small pig within 100,000 years of the extinction. This rate of size increase is extraordinary even by the standards of evolutionary change. It represents what biologists call an ecological release, a period during which the absence of competitive and predatory constraints allows a group to explore its full range of developmental possibilities at a pace that normal ecological conditions would never allow. The evolutionary potential for large body size had been present in the mammalian genome for millions of years, suppressed by the ecological constraints of the Mesozoic. Remove the constraints and the potential expresses itself. The early large mammals of the Paleocene were not the large mammals we know today. They belonged to groups that are now extinct, archaic lineages that diversified rapidly in the early Paleocene and then mostly disappeared before the Eocene had run its course, replaced by the lineages that gave rise to the modern orders of mammals. These archaic mammals have names that sound like minor characters in a fantasy novel: condylarths and multituberculates and pantodonts and tillodontians and tarniodonts. They were, in their own time, the dominant large animals of the northern continents, filling the herbivore and omnivore roles vacated by the dinosaurs, developing diverse body plans and feeding strategies in the warm, recovering forests of the Paleocene. The relationship between these early mammals and the birds of the Paleocene is one of the underexplored chapters of the post-extinction world. We tend to think of birds and mammals as occupying different spaces: the air and the ground, the canopy and the understory, the sky and the soil, and there is truth to this. But the early Paleocene was a world where the ecological roles were not yet fixed, where the boundaries between what birds did and what mammals did were being negotiated in real time through the ordinary mechanisms of competition and specialization. Some mammals were climbing trees, occupying arboreal niches that birds also used. Some mammals were pursuing insects in the low vegetation where ground foraging birds also foraged. The interactions between the two groups in this period of ecological flux helped to shape what each group became. The archaic primates, the ancestors of all modern monkeys and apes and humans, appeared very early in the Paleocene, within a few million years of the extinction. This is not surprising from one angle, because the ecological pressures driving the diversification of early mammals would have been felt equally by the primate ancestors as by other mammalian groups. But it is striking from another angle because it means that the lineage that would eventually give rise to the species writing this story and reading it was already present and diversifying in the world that the bird survivors of the asteroid were helping to rebuild. The primates and the birds have been part of the same world, parts of the same ecological networks, since the earliest days of the Paleocene. The early primates were arboreal, tree-dwelling animals with grasping hands and feet, forward-facing eyes that provided the binocular vision useful for judging distances in a three-dimensional canopy environment, and an increasing reliance on visual communication and social learning. They were not the only arboreal mammals, and the competition for the tree-living niche in the Paleocene and Eocene forests was intense, with different groups of mammals competing for the same ecological space. But the primates, with their particular combination of traits, grasping hands and binocular vision and social intelligence, were especially well equipped for life in the complex social environments of the warming Eocene forests, and their lineage diversified steadily through the period. The archaic carnivores appeared alongside the herbivores and omnivores, filling the predator niche that had been vacated by the extinction of the large theropod dinosaurs. These were not initially the elegant, specialized carnivores we associate with the modern carnivora order, the cats and dogs and bears. They were earlier, cruder versions of the same ecological role, the myacids and creodonts, animals with large teeth and powerful jaws that were effective predators but lacked the refinements of locomotion and dental specialization that would characterize their successors. They preyed on the early herbivorous mammals, and they competed in the forests of the Eocene with the raptorial birds that were occupying the same large prey predator niche from the aerial angle. The competition between mammalian and avian predators is a thread that runs through the entire post-extinction story, and it has no single winner. In different environments and at different times, one group or the other has been dominant. The terror birds dominated the large predator niche in South America for 50 million years without significant competition from mammalian carnivores. On the northern continents, where placental mammalian carnivores diversified earlier and more thoroughly, the raptorial birds filled different ecological roles, becoming aerial hunters of medium-sized prey rather than ground-based hunters of large prey. The outcome depended on the particular history and geography of each region, which is precisely what you would expect from two groups of intelligent, active, warm-blooded predators competing for similar resources with different but equally effective toolkits. The mammals were developing something in this period that would eventually become very important, and it is something birds had already discovered long before: complex social behavior. The early mammals were not, as far as we can tell, highly social animals in the way that many modern mammals are. They were probably solitary or loosely associated in the manner of most modern generalist mammals. But within the archaic mammals of the Paleocene, some lineages were beginning to develop more complex social structures, group living arrangements that provided advantages in finding food, detecting predators, and raising young. This social complexity, which the primates would eventually take to extraordinary lengths, was one of the most important developments of the Paleocene period. There is a particular thought about this chapter of the story that offers something useful for sleep. The mammals of the Paleocene were, in a real sense, the darkness dwellers coming into light. They had spent 60 million years in the shadow of the dinosaurs, small and nocturnal and constrained. And then the world changed, and they stepped out of the shadow into the full complexity of the ecological space that had always been there but had never been available to them. There is something in this story that resonates perhaps with something in the experience of rest. The quietness of sleep is not nothing. The dark hours are not wasted hours. Things happen in the dark that cannot happen in the light: restoration and consolidation, and the quiet accumulation of readiness for what comes next. The mammals that came out of the Cretaceous shadow were not the most impressive animals that had ever lived. They were not the largest or the fastest or the most elaborately specialized. They were the ones that had survived by being flexible and small and capable of living on what was available in difficult conditions. And from those survivors, in the warmth and abundance of the Paleocene and Eocene, came everything. Every whale and elephant and bat and bear. Every primate from tarsier to human being, every rat and rabbit and horse and whale, the entire spectacular diversity of modern mammalian life traces back to the small, shadow-dwelling survivors of the Mesozoic night, just as every modern bird traces back to the small, ground-foraging survivors of the asteroid winter. The birds and the mammals thus share something important. Both groups are the products of catastrophe and survival. Both groups spent long periods as marginal, constrained, small-bodied animals in the shadow of something larger and more dominant. Both groups inherited the Earth when the larger things were gone. And both groups explored their inherited potential with an energy and diversity that produced the world you live in, the world of 10,000 bird species and approximately 5,000 mammal species, the world of wings and fur and complex social behavior and intelligence and song. This world is the product of the survivors. It was built from what was left when almost everything else was gone. And what was built from those small survivors is, by any measure, extraordinary. The Eocene and Oligocene saw the mammals and the birds settling into something like their modern relationship. The birds maintained their dominance in the aerial spaces and the coastal marine environments. The mammals consolidated their dominance as large terrestrial animals. Each group developed in the presence of the other, shaped by competition and interaction. Their ecologies interleaved in ways that made each group's success partly dependent on the other. A world without large mammalian herbivores maintaining grasslands would have been a different world for the grass seed-eating birds that depend on those grasslands. A world without birds dispersing seeds and pollinating flowers would have been a different world for the mammals that feed on fruits and seeds. Rest in this thought as you descend towards sleep. The world outside your window is the product of the partnership of two groups of survivors, birds and mammals, who came through the same catastrophe by different routes and then built the modern world together over 66 million years. The bird in the tree and the mammals on the ground, competing sometimes, cooperating sometimes, ignoring each other most of the time, but always present in the same world, always part of the same ecological web. You are a mammal. The bird in the tree is a dinosaur. 66 million years ago, both your ancestors were small, cold, and hungry in the dark. Tonight, one of you is sleeping in a tree. The other is sleeping in something more elaborate. But both are sleeping as the survivors have always slept, waiting for the morning. The Eocene world was larger than our world. Not in terms of the total surface area of the Earth, which has not changed significantly in the last 50 million years, but in terms of the ecological space available to flying animals. There were more forests, covering land that is now grassland or desert or ice sheet. There were more coastal wetlands, where the sea met the land in shallow, productive margins. There were more islands at various configurations of the continents as the tectonic plates slowly moved toward their current positions. And the skies over all of this land and water were available, vast and open and stocked with the insects and fish and wind currents and thermal columns that make flight worthwhile. The birds spread into all of it. They spread as though they were water finding its level, moving into every available space, finding ecological roles that no bird had previously occupied, exploring the full physical range of what a warm-blooded, feathered, hollow-boned animal could be. The most dramatic of the Eocene bird experiments, at least in terms of scale, was the giant penguins. Modern penguins are not small animals. The emperor penguin, which stands about a meter tall and weighs up to 40 kilograms, is already an impressive creature by any standard. But the giant penguins of the Eocene were something else entirely. Fossils from New Zealand, South America, and Antarctica, which in the Eocene was significantly warmer and more accessible than it is today, show penguin species standing nearly 2 meters tall and weighing close to 115 kilograms. These were not the sleek, comic-seeming creatures of modern popular imagination. They were massive, with large heads and heavy bills suited to catching large fish and possibly squid in the warm Eocene oceans. The giant penguins lived in a world where the waters around Antarctica were warm enough to sustain diverse fish communities, where the ocean currents that today drive cold Antarctic water northward and sustain the extraordinarily productive polar seas had not yet established themselves. In those warm southern oceans, the giant penguins occupied an ecological role somewhere between a modern penguin and a modern large marine predator, perhaps comparable to a small sea lion in terms of the size and type of prey they could pursue. They existed for millions of years before gradually declining as the world cooled and the Antarctic environment became less hospitable, leaving behind the smaller, more cold-adapted penguin species that persist today. Europe in the Eocene was an archipelago, not the solid landmass we know today, but a collection of islands separated by shallow seas, the remnant of the great shallow marine environments that had covered much of Europe during the Cretaceous. These islands were warm and forested and productive, and they were home to a variety of bird species that illustrates the principle of island biogeography, the tendency of island populations to evolve in distinctive directions under the influence of the particular ecological conditions of their isolated environment. Among the most striking of the European island birds of the Eocene was Gastornis. Gastornis was the European answer to the South American terror birds, a giant flightless bird standing nearly 2 meters tall with a massive hooked beak and powerful legs. It occupied the large predator niche in the forests and open areas of Eocene Europe in the absence of the large mammalian carnivores that had not yet diversified into that ecological role in Europe. For a long time, Gastornis was assumed to have been a predator, a European equivalent of the terror birds, hunting the early mammals of the Eocene forests. More recent analysis of its beak morphology and the chemical signatures preserved in its bones have suggested a different interpretation, that Gastornis may have been a herbivore, using its massive beak not to kill animals but to crack the large, hard seeds and nuts that were abundant in the Eocene forests. Whether predator or herbivore, Gastornis was the apex large animal of Eocene Europe, the most imposing creature in its environment, occupying a role that in earlier times had been occupied by dinosaurs and that would later be occupied by large mammals. Its presence in the European fossil record for a span of several million years is testimony to the adaptability of the avian body plan, its capacity to be scaled up to sizes and ecological roles that seem, from our modern perspective, unlikely for a bird. The birds of the Eocene were not constrained by the limits of what modern birds do, they were exploring the full range of what birds could be. The seabirds of the Eocene deserve particular attention here because they represent one of the most extraordinary radiations in bird history. The transition from terrestrial or freshwater bird to true oceanic bird is not a simple one. It requires a suite of adaptations that allow an animal to survive in the open ocean environment, far from land, for weeks or months at a time. These adaptations include waterproofing of the feathers sufficient to prevent hypothermia during repeated dives or wave impacts, physiological tolerance of salt because the ocean provides no fresh water, the ability to navigate across featureless expanses of water without reference landmarks, and the physical capability to cover vast distances efficiently, either by powered flight or by the dynamic soaring that the albatross family perfected. The ancestors of the modern albatross family appear in the Eocene fossil record, already showing the elongated wing proportions that characterize the living members of the group. The albatross wing is one of the most geometrically precise aerodynamic structures in the natural world, with an aspect ratio, the ratio of length to width, that exceeds that of many sailplane designs. This wing design is not well suited for flapping flight, which requires a different wing shape, but it is extraordinary for soaring, and specifically for the dynamic soaring technique that allows albatrosses to extract energy from the wind gradient above the ocean surface. The Eocene ancestors of modern albatrosses were developing the anatomical foundations of this capability, their wings growing longer and narrower over millions of years in response to the selective advantages of effortless oceanic travel. The sheer waters and petrels, the other major groups of true oceanic birds, were also diversifying in the Eocene. These birds, which dive into the water to catch fish and squid, developed different solutions to the problems of oceanic life than the albatrosses. Rather than soaring above the waves, they are adapted for penetrating the water surface, folding their wings back and diving to depths of dozens of meters to pursue prey. The muscular architecture of a diving seabird is quite different from that of a soaring seabird, and the Eocene saw both strategies being refined simultaneously, suggesting that the Eocene oceans were rich enough to reward both approaches to the same resource. On land, the Eocene saw the continuation and acceleration of the forest bird diversification that had begun in the Paleocene. The Oscine passerines, the songbirds, were expanding from their origin in the Australian region northward and westward, following the land connections that periodically formed between the southern and northern continents as sea levels rose and fell. The raptors were diversifying into distinct groups, with the hawks and eagles taking different ecological niches from the falcons, the owls developing independently into the dominant nocturnal predators of the forest and open country. The woodpeckers were beginning to specialize in the bark foraging niche, developing the reinforced skull structure and shock-absorbing beak that allows them to drill into living wood without brain injury. The shorebirds and wading birds were exploring the coastal environments with a thoroughness that produced some of the most ecologically specialized and visually distinctive birds of the modern world. The flamingos, those extraordinary filter feeders that strain tiny organisms from shallow, often highly saline lakes, established their unique ecological strategy in this period. The herons and egrets, the ibises and spoonbills, the rails and coots that inhabit the freshwater margins, all were diversifying in the warm, wet, coastal and wetland environments of the Eocene. These environments were more extensive in the warm Eocene world than they are today, providing the ecological space for a richness of species in the wetland bird guild that has never been equaled. There is something worth dwelling on about the way the Eocene world looked from the air, from the perspective of one of the spreading seabirds or land birds of the period. 60 million years after the asteroid, the planet had recovered not just to its former complexity, but beyond it, producing an ecological richness that was genuinely new in the history of life. The mammals were large and diverse and present in every terrestrial ecosystem. The flowering plants had transformed the land into a world of fruits and seeds and nectars of extraordinary variety. The warm oceans were teeming with the fish and squid and crustaceans that supported diverse marine predator communities. And in the air, above all of this, the birds were moving, 10,000 proto-species or more, finding their way into every ecological space that a feathered, warm-blooded, hollow-boned animal could occupy. The Oligocene that followed the Eocene brought cooling. The warm world of the early Cenozoic began its long, slow transition toward the cooler, more seasonal world of the Miocene and Pliocene and eventually the Pleistocene ice ages. This cooling had consequences for the birds that had diversified in the warmth. Some lineages contracted, their ranges shrinking as the forests they depended on retreated toward the tropics. Others adapted to the new conditions, evolving tolerance for cold and seasonal variation. Still others moved with their preferred habitats, their populations tracking the shifting climate zones as the world cooled and dried and the grasslands expanded at the expense of the forests. The expansion of grasslands in the Miocene and Pliocene was one of the most important ecological transitions since the KPG extinction, and it had profound effects on bird evolution. Grasslands support a very different suite of bird species than forests. Ground-nesting birds, seed-eating birds, open country raptors with long wings and sharp eyes suited for scanning vast horizontal distances, flocking birds that use the open grassland as a space for collective anti-predator behavior. All of these ecological strategies were available in embryonic form in the bird lineages of the Eocene and Oligocene, but they became dominant ecological characters only as the grasslands expanded. The modern bird of prey, the falcon, or the harrier, or the kestrel hanging motionless in the air over an open field, is in some sense a product of the grassland expansion of the late Cenozoic, shaped by the same ecological transformation that produced the modern ungulates and the modern large carnivores. Tonight, wherever you are, there are birds sleeping. Not far from where you lie, within perhaps a few hundred meters in any but the most urban of environments, something with feathers has tucked its head under its wing and settled its weight onto the branch or the grass or the reed bed that serves as its roost. Its heartbeat has slowed to a fraction of its waking rate. Its temperature has dropped slightly. Its eyes, which during the day would be tracking movement with precision and sensitivity that our own vision cannot match, are closed. It is doing what birds have been doing since the earliest Paleocene, since the first survivors of the asteroid winter curled themselves against the cold and waited for the world to remember warmth. It is sleeping. It is conserving. It is being alive in the most patient and fundamental way possible. The spreading of wings that began in the Eocene has not stopped. It is happening right now, in the form of the 10,000 species that fill the sky and the forest and the ocean and the grassland of the modern world. Each one the product of 66 million years of divergence and adaptation and specialization from that original ground-dwelling ancestor. The albatross over the Southern Ocean is carrying the inheritance of the Eocene seabird that first learned to soar. The woodpecker in the forest is carrying the inheritance of the Eocene bark forager that first learned to drill. The songbird outside your window is carrying the inheritance of the Eocene passerine that first learned to learn its song rather than simply inheriting it. Rest now and let that thought be the last one. The wings have spread, the world is full. Sleep in the knowledge that the birds are out there doing what they have always done right through the long night. There is a bird, perhaps very close to where you are right now, that is a dinosaur. Not in a poetic sense, not in the sense of metaphor or analogy, but in the precise biological sense that matters to taxonomy. It belongs to the clade Dinosauria. It is classified, along with Tyrannosaurus rex and Triceratops and Brachiosaurus and Velociraptor, as a dinosaur because the clade Dinosauria is defined by a set of physical characteristics, and the bird outside your window possesses those characteristics: its hollow bones, its upright stance with legs directly beneath its body. The wishbone, the furcula, which is present in every modern bird and was also present in the theropod dinosaurs, the scales on its feet, which are a direct physical heritage from the scaled skin of its dinosaur ancestors. It is a dinosaur. It has always been a dinosaur. It is just a particularly successful and well-disguised one. The recognition that birds are living dinosaurs is one of the more important conceptual shifts in the history of biology, and it has been arriving gradually since the 19th century, when Thomas Henry Huxley first noted the extraordinary similarities between the skeleton of the early bird Archaeopteryx and the skeleton of the theropod dinosaur Compsognathus. Huxley called birds glorified reptiles, which was an overstatement in one direction and an understatement in another, and the debate over exactly where in the family tree birds belonged continued through most of the 20th century. It was only with the explosion of feathered dinosaur discoveries from China in the 1990s and the application of cladistic analysis to the problem that the question was resolved definitively. Birds are not like dinosaurs. Birds are not descended from dinosaurs. Birds are dinosaurs. Once you accept this, once you let it fully settle into your understanding of the world, the birds around you begin to look different. The crow that has been watching you from the fence is not a distant relative of Velociraptor. It is a velociraptor in the sense that it belongs to the same biological group, the Maniraptoran theropods, separated from the non-avian Maniraptorans by 66 million years of evolution, rather than by any fundamental biological discontinuity. The hollow bones of the crow are the hollow bones of the theropod, the wishbone. The wishbone of the crow is the wishbone of the theropod, present in both, serving the same biomechanical function of springing the forelimbs forward during the powerful stroke that in one case is a wing beat and in the other case is a killing grasp. The relationship between modern birds and their closest living relatives, the crocodilians, is one of the most surprising facts in modern biology to most people who encounter it for the first time. Birds and crocodiles look nothing alike, behave nothing alike, and occupy completely different ecological roles in the modern world. One is a feathered, flying, warm-blooded singer of the dawn. The other is a scaly, semi-aquatic, cold-blooded ambush predator of the river margins. Yet when molecular biologists compare the DNA sequences of modern animals, they find that birds and crocodilians share more DNA in common with each other than either shares with any other living reptile group. The lizards and snakes and turtles, which look more similar to crocodiles than birds do, are actually more distantly related to crocodiles than birds are. This is because birds and crocodilians are both archosaurs, members of a group that diverged from the rest of the reptiles over 250 million years ago, and they have maintained that close relationship at the molecular level even as their bodies and behaviors have diverged to the point of apparent incomparability. There are behaviors in modern birds that are unmistakably of dinosaurian heritage, moments when the ancient origin of these animals is visible right through the feathers and the modern comportment. Bird nesting behavior is one of the most striking. We have fossils of dinosaurs, specifically troodontids like Troodon and the Hadrosaur Maiasaura, that show nesting behaviors that are essentially identical to those seen in some modern birds. The eggs arranged in careful spiral patterns within a nest bowl. The adult animal in a brooding posture, its body over the eggs, arms and legs arranged to maximize contact and warmth transfer. The nest site chosen for exposure to sunlight to maximize the passive heat available for incubation. These are not behaviors that birds developed independently after the extinction. These are behaviors that were already present in the dinosaurian ancestors of birds, preserved in the fossil record, carried forward through the extinction into the modern nesting habits of every bird alive today. The way birds hold their heads is a dinosaurian heritage. The slightly angled, rapidly rotating head movement of a bird scanning its environment is the same movement pattern we see modeled for theropod dinosaurs based on the orientation of their semicircular canals, which control balance and head orientation. The way a bird swallows, by tilting its head back to move food down its throat using gravity to assist, is directly analogous to the swallowing mechanism of theropod dinosaurs, which also lacked the muscular tongue that mammals use to move food to the back of the throat. Even the way a bird tucks its wings against its body when at rest, folding the wing bones in a specific Z-shaped configuration that maintains the shape of the wing without requiring constant muscular effort, is a configuration that appears in the fossil record of non-avian theropods, present before flight was a factor, a heritage from the dinosaurian ancestors that flight then co-opted for a new purpose. The visual world of birds is a dimension of reality that we cannot directly experience, and this too reflects a dinosaurian heritage that extends beyond what most people realize. Modern birds see ultraviolet light. Their eyes have 4 types of color receptor cells, compared to the 3 that humans have, and the 4th type is sensitive to ultraviolet wavelengths that are invisible to us. This means that the world as a bird sees it has a dimension of color and pattern that is completely hidden from human perception. Many birds have plumage patterns that appear uniform to human eyes, but are strikingly marked in ultraviolet, patterns used in mate choice and species recognition that we can only see with special cameras designed to detect UV light. This ultraviolet vision was almost certainly present in the theropod dinosaurs, whose eyes show anatomical structures consistent with 4 receptor color vision, and it was maintained through the extinction and through 66 million years of bird evolution because it remained useful. The thermoregulation of modern birds carries another visible link to their dinosaurian heritage. Birds are among the most efficient thermoregulators of any living animal, capable of maintaining their body temperatures within narrow ranges across a huge variety of environmental conditions. Some species of birds enter a state of greatly reduced metabolic activity called torpor, similar to but not identical with mammalian hibernation during cold nights or periods of food shortage. Hummingbirds do this every night, their body temperature dropping from approximately 40 degrees Celsius to near ambient temperature, their heart rate falling from hundreds of beats per minute to as few as 50, their metabolic rate reduced to a tiny fraction of its waking level. In the morning, they warm themselves back up using a combination of shivering and postural changes to capture sunlight, and within minutes they are operating at full capacity again. This daily cycle of metabolic reduction and revival is an ancient trait, and it may well have been one of the mechanisms that helped the ancestors of birds survive the coldest nights of the nuclear winter. There is a thought experiment that is useful here, one that might serve your rest if you allow yourself to follow it. Imagine a velociraptor, the real animal, rather than the Hollywood version. The real velociraptor was about the size of a turkey, significantly smaller than the animals in the films, with a covering of feathers that have been confirmed by fossilized quill knobs on the arm bones. It was warm-blooded, or close to it. It had a wishbone. It had hollow bones. It had a respiratory system with air sacs. It had a brain that was large relative to its body for a reptile. It was social, probably, based on the evidence of multiple individuals found at the same sites. Now imagine, standing next to this velociraptor, a modern wild turkey. The differences are real. The turkey has wings adapted for flight, a reduced tail, no teeth, a different beak shape. But the similarities, the body plan, the posture, the locomotion, the respiratory system, the bone structure, these are overwhelming. The turkey is not very different from the velociraptor. The turkey is a velociraptor that has had 66 million years to change in a particular direction. The fossil record of this transition from non-avian theropod to modern bird is now extraordinarily rich, particularly because of the discoveries made in the Liaoning province of China since the 1990s. The Yixian and Jiufatang formations in Liaoning have produced hundreds of feathered dinosaur specimens, representing dozens of species in various stages of the transition from non-avian dinosaur to modern bird. These specimens show the gradual acquisition of the features we associate with modern birds: the reduction of the tail, the development of the furcula, the modification of the forelimb into a wing, the development of complex feathers with the barbed and barbule structure necessary for aerodynamic function. Each specimen represents a point on a continuum, and the continuum is so well preserved that the transition, once considered a major gap in the fossil record, is now one of the best documented major evolutionary transitions in the history of life. The wishbone, the furcula, is worth dwelling on for a moment because it is one of the structures that most clearly illustrates the continuity between dinosaurs and birds. In modern birds, the furcula is a Y-shaped bone formed by the fusion of the two clavicles, the collarbones. It acts as a spring during the wing beat cycle, flexing outward as the wings are brought down and snapping back to store and then release energy for the next wing beat. It is essential for efficient flight, but it is also present in non-avian theropod dinosaurs that almost certainly could not fly at all. In these dinosaurs, it served a different biomechanical function, stiffening the shoulder girdle and transmitting the forces generated by the arm muscles during the capturing of prey. When the theropod forelimb became a wing, the furcula was co-opted for a new function, the same bone in a different context, doing a different job. This is how evolution works, repurposing existing structures for new roles rather than inventing new structures from nothing. Look at the next bird you see with this knowledge in mind. Whatever species it is, wherever you encounter it, allow yourself to see it as what it actually is: a theropod dinosaur modified by 66 million years of post-Cretaceous evolution, carrying in its body the structural heritage of its Mesozoic ancestors. The hollow bones are the bones of a theropod. The wishbone is the wishbone of a theropod. The scales on its feet are the scales of a theropod. The respiratory system with its air sacs is the respiratory system of a theropod, and somewhere in its genome, among the hundreds of thousands of genes that direct the construction of its body during development, there are the ghost genes, the silenced but still present instructions for building a toothed jaw, the last molecular legacy of the long age before the asteroid, when the ancestors of all modern birds still had teeth in their beaks and were still visibly, unmistakably, recognizably dinosaurs. The bird is a disguise. And the disguise is extraordinary. It has fooled most people most of the time for most of human history. We classified birds as a group separate from reptiles, separate from dinosaurs, as if the feathers and the flight and the song had made them something entirely new. And in some ways, of course, they have. 66 million years of evolution has produced extraordinary changes. But in the ways that matter most for understanding what the bird actually is, the changes are superficial. Underneath the feathers, underneath the flight adaptations, underneath the beak that replaced the toothed jaw, the dinosaur is still there. It has always been there. It will be there in the morning, sitting on its branch, scratching at the ground with its scaled feet, tilting its head to scan the sky with its ultraviolet sensitive eyes, breathing with its dinosaurian air sac system, being what it has always been. Let this thought be a kind of marvel as you settle towards sleep, not a complicated marvel, not one that requires further analysis or reflection, but simply the quiet wonder of the fact itself. The bird outside is a dinosaur. The bird outside is a dinosaur. The bird outside is a dinosaur. 66 million years have passed, and the asteroid hit, and the world went dark, and the survivors came through, and the world rebuilt itself, and here we are, and the bird outside is still a dinosaur, singing in the morning, flying through the afternoon, sleeping in the dark, dreaming whatever birds dream in the tree outside your window in this ancient and extraordinary world. There is an experiment that has been performed many times in many different research settings with many different species of birds, and the result is always somewhat disconcerting in the most wonderful way. The experiment involves a problem that requires planning, that requires understanding the relationship between a tool and its purpose, that requires the ability to model a future state that does not yet exist, and to take actions in the present that will bring that future state into being. The kind of problem that we have long assumed requires a relatively advanced brain, relatively large, relatively complex, organized in the particular way that mammalian brains are organized. Then researchers put a corvid, a crow, or a raven, or a jackdaw, or a rook in front of the problem, and the bird solves it, often on the first or second attempt, often with a creativity that suggests not just learned behavior, but genuine insight. Crows can manufacture tools, not find tools, not pick up convenient sticks, but manufacture them, selecting appropriate raw materials and modifying them to create implements suited to specific tasks. New Caledonian crows, a species studied intensively at the University of Auckland and other institutions, fashion hooks from wire to retrieve food from tubes, bending the wire at the appropriate angle, something that requires understanding both the geometry of the problem and the properties of the material. They pass this tool-making knowledge between generations through social learning, creating what amounts to a cultural tradition of tool use that is maintained independently of genetic transmission. The technique is learned, shared, modified, and improved across generations of birds in a process that parallels, in its basic structure, the accumulation of human technological knowledge. Ravens can plan for the future. In a now famous series of experiments conducted in Sweden, ravens were shown a tool that could be used to open a puzzle box to retrieve food. The box and the food were then removed. The next day, the ravens were given a choice between the tool they had seen the day before and various other objects. The ravens consistently chose the tool, then used it to open the box when it was presented. This is future planning. The raven in the present moment was making a decision based on a predicted future state that it had modeled from experience. Future planning of this kind was, until very recently, considered a uniquely human or at most uniquely primate capability. The ravens are doing it too. The cognitive complexity of corvids, the family that includes crows, ravens, rooks, jackdaws, jays, and magpies, is now considered by researchers in comparative psychology to be roughly comparable to that of the great apes in many domains of problem-solving and social cognition. This is remarkable partly because of what it implies about what is possible with a bird-sized brain, and partly because of what it tells us about the relationship between intelligence and brain architecture. The mammalian brain and the avian brain are organized quite differently. Mammals have a layered neocortex, the six-layered sheet of neural tissue that is associated with advanced cognition in mammals. Birds do not have this structure, but birds have developed their own form of densely interconnected neural tissue, organized differently but achieving similar levels of computational power. Two different architectural solutions to the same engineering problem, both finding their way to roughly comparable capabilities. What is the evolutionary history of this intelligence? When did corvid cognition become so sophisticated? The honest answer is that we do not know precisely, because brain tissue does not fossilize and cognitive capabilities cannot be directly measured from bones. But we can make educated inferences. The corvid family appears in the fossil record in the Miocene approximately 15 to 20 million years ago, already diversifying into the range of species and ecological roles that characterizes the modern family. Their brain-to-body ratios, which are among the highest of any bird group, were almost certainly present early in the family's history because the selective pressures that drove the evolution of large brains, the complex social environments, and the need to remember large numbers of individuals and their relative social positions were present from the beginning. Corvid intelligence is not a recent development. It has been building, probably, since before the genus Homo existed. The migration of birds is another dimension of the living archive, another place where we can see tens of millions of years of accumulated evolutionary knowledge encoded in the behavior of a modern animal. Bird migration is one of the most extraordinary phenomena in the natural world, and it remains, despite decades of intensive study, imperfectly understood. We know the broad outlines, that many bird species travel between breeding grounds at higher latitudes and wintering grounds at lower latitudes, that they navigate using a combination of star patterns, magnetic field detection, and memorized visual landmarks, that they are capable of making journeys of tens of thousands of kilometers with a precision that GPS technology can barely match. But there are aspects of migration that remain genuinely mysterious. One of the most intriguing is what researchers have called the magnetic map. Birds can detect the Earth's magnetic field, and they use information from this field not just for compass direction, but for something more sophisticated, a form of magnetic positioning that allows them to determine not just which direction is north, but where they are on the planet in terms of latitude and longitude. The molecular mechanism for this is still being worked out, but it appears to involve magnetite crystals in the beak and possibly quantum effects in the eye involving a protein called cryptochrome. This is among the most exotic physics operating in any animal's sensory system, a molecular-scale quantum mechanical process in the eye of a bird, providing a magnetic positioning capability that we are only now beginning to understand. There is a stranger fact about bird migration that was only proposed and investigated in the last few decades, and it touches on something that suggests the deep antiquity of the behavior. Some researchers have proposed that the migration routes of some bird species encode memories of ancient landscapes that no longer exist. The idea is this: migration routes are partly inherited, encoded in the genome by selective pressure over many generations. The selection that shaped a particular route was the success or failure of birds following slightly different routes in the past. If the routes were shaped by selective pressure operating over hundreds of thousands of years, the routes might reflect the landscape as it was during those hundreds of thousands of years, which was the Pleistocene, the Ice Age world. Some migration routes that take birds on seemingly inefficient detours, routes that make no sense in terms of the current geography, might be reflections of shorelines and forest edges and mountain passes that existed during the Ice Ages and have since changed or disappeared. The birds are following paths worn into their genomes by the feet of their ancestors in a world that is largely gone. The diversity of modern birds, 10,000 species in families and genera and species that have been described and named and studied, represents not just a large number but a large range of ecological roles, behaviors, body plans, and evolutionary solutions to the basic challenges of being a warm-blooded feathered animal. Consider the range: a bee hummingbird the smallest living bird, weighs approximately 2 grams and can barely be seen clearly when it hovers. An ostrich can weigh 160 kilograms and runs at speeds of up to 70 kilometers per hour. An albatross flies from continent to continent without landing for weeks. A penguin dives to depths of 500 meters in water close to freezing. A cliff swallow builds a mud nest on a vertical rock face and returns to exactly the same nest site year after year for its entire life. A ptarmigan changes its plumage color from white to brown and back again twice a year to match the changing appearance of its Arctic environment. All of these are the same basic animal. All of these are birds. The variety is the product of 66 million years of exploration of what a bird can be. The songs of birds carry their own archive. A bird song is not a fixed thing, transmitted unchanged from parent to offspring in the way that a genetic trait is transmitted. It is learned, and because it is learned, it changes. It accumulates variations as individual birds add personal modifications to the basic pattern they learned from their parents. It drifts across generations and across populations and across geography, so that birds of the same species living in different areas gradually develop different dialects, different versions of the same basic song structure that are recognizable as related but distinguishable to anyone who has spent enough time listening. This cultural drift in birdsong is analogous to the drift in human language over time, and it has been measured and documented in numerous species. The whip-poor-will singing in the forest east of the Mississippi has a subtly different song than the whip-poor-will singing west of the Mississippi because the populations have been separated long enough for their learned song traditions to diverge. This transmission of learned information across generations, this accumulation of cultural knowledge that is not encoded in DNA but is passed from individual to individual through observation and practice, is one of the most interesting aspects of advanced cognition in birds, and it is one of the things that makes the cognitively sophisticated bird species most similar to humans in the way they engage with their world. The crow family, the parrots, and some other species maintain genuine cultural traditions, learned behaviors that are passed between individuals and modified over time. A population of New Caledonian crows in one part of the island makes one style of stick tool. A population in another part of the island makes a different style. Each population learns its technique from its elders, and the techniques persist across generations because they are socially transmitted rather than genetically fixed. This is, in its basic structure, the same process that maintains and transmits human technology and cultural knowledge, a different version of the same mechanism found in a group of animals whose ancestors survived the asteroid 66 million years ago. The parrots deserve a moment of particular attention here, both because of their cognitive sophistication and because of their position as one of the most ancient surviving bird lineages. Parrots can learn human words and use them in contextually appropriate ways. This is not simple mimicry, not the rote repetition of sounds heard without understanding. Studies by the late animal psychologist Irene Pepperberg with an African grey parrot named Alex demonstrated that Alex could use human words to identify objects by colour, shape, and material, to ask for specific items, to express what appeared to be preferences and emotional states, and to demonstrate number concepts at the level of small integers. Whether Alex had genuine language comprehension in the way that humans do is debated. But the cognitive capabilities required to perform the tasks Alex reliably performed are substantial, and they suggest a form of abstract conceptual thinking that we might not have expected to find in an animal descended from the ground foraging survivors of an asteroid impact. There is a particular fact about parrots and their relation to other birds that very few people know, and it is one of the more striking revelations of recent molecular biology. Parrots are the closest living relatives of songbirds. Despite their very different appearance and behavior, the genetic evidence is clear that parrots and passerines are each other's closest relatives, forming a group called Psittacopasserai. This means that the two most cognitively sophisticated groups of birds, the two groups most capable of vocal learning, and the two groups that show the most complex learned social behaviors are also each other's closest relatives. It is possible that the common ancestor of parrots and songbirds already possessed the neural substrates for vocal learning and complex social cognition, and that both groups have independently elaborated these capabilities in their own directions. Or it is possible that they share a common inherited basis for these capabilities that their shared ancestor possessed. Either way, the cognitive sophistication of modern birds is not a coincidence or a series of independent accidents. It has deep roots in the avian family tree. Tonight, the birds that will sing tomorrow morning are already silent. They have settled into their roosting postures, their heads tucked, their feathers fluffed against the night air, their metabolic rates reduced to their resting levels. They will spend the night in a state that is not quite like human sleep, but serves similar functions, consolidating information gathered during the day, maintaining the cellular machinery of their extraordinarily active bodies, drawing on their fat reserves to maintain body temperature through the dark hours. In the morning, some of them will begin singing before the sky has even begun to lighten, not because they need to, not because there is urgency in the first notes of the dawn chorus, but because it is what they do. Because 66 million years of being birds have made the morning song as natural as breathing. The living archive is all around us. Every bird that has ever crossed your field of vision was a living document of the history of the survivors, a walking, flying, singing repository of 66 million years of adaptation and innovation and persistence. You do not need a fossil bed or a genetics laboratory to access this archive. You need only to look at the bird on the branch, to really look at it, to see past the familiarity and the smallness and the ordinariness and recognize what it actually is. An animal that came through the worst catastrophe in the history of complex life. An animal that has been exploring what birds can be for 66 million years and has not finished yet. An animal that is, in the precise biological sense of the word, a dinosaur. Still here, still alive, still singing every morning at dawn in exactly the way its ancestors were already singing when the first proper forests were growing back in the warm Paleocene world. The living archive, right there. Sleeping in the dark, just like you. Let the story settle now. Let everything you have heard drift down, slowly, the way leaves drift down in autumn when there is no wind to carry them sideways, just the quiet pull of gravity, the slow, inevitable descent toward rest. You do not need to remember any of it. You do not need to hold on to the dates or the names or the geological epochs. You do not need to know the KPG boundary from the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum or distinguish a terror bird from an early passerine. Let all of that go. What remains when the facts go is something simpler and more lasting than any fact. The feeling of deep time, the sense of 66 million years, vast and real and full, stretching behind the present moment like an ocean behind a shore. The bird in the tree outside is sleeping. Its chest rises and falls in the small, rapid rhythm of a bird's breathing, faster than yours, but just as regular, just as certain. It has been doing this in one form or another through all the nights of 66 million years. The great events of its lineage's history, the nuclear winter and the fern spike and the Eocene warming and the spread of grasslands and the Great American Interchange, all of these happened, in a sense, in the dark hours between one generation's sleep and the next. The world changed around sleeping birds, and the birds woke into a different world, and they adapted, and they slept again. This is the cadence of deep time. This is the rhythm that underlies everything. Let your breathing slow to match the night, not the rapid breathing of the bird, which is the breathing of a creature that burns energy at rates you cannot sustain, but your own breathing, slower and deeper, the breathing of a warm-blooded mammal at rest, the same breathing that your ancestors were doing in their burrows on the night before the asteroid arrived, not knowing that they were about to inherit the Earth. The breath goes in, the breath goes out. The chest rises, the chest falls, the heart beats, the world turns. The stars move overhead, and somewhere, in the tree outside, the bird is sleeping. 66 million years. Let that number become soft in your mind. Let it stop being a number and become a texture, a feeling, something warm and wide and deep. The weight of all that time, the patience of all those generations, the small, stubborn, magnificent fact of still being here, still breathing. Still part of the living world that the survivors built in the aftermath of the worst morning in the history of complex life. You are part of that world. You are the product of that survival, as the bird in the tree is the product of that survival. Each of you the living continuation of a chain that goes back further than easy imagination can follow. Each of you tonight resting in the world that your ancestors' survival made possible. Let your thoughts drift now. The way clouds drift on a windless day, slowly, without direction, changing shape as they go. Let the Cretaceous forest come if it wants to. The warm air and the high ferns and the distant sound of hadrosaurs moving through the undergrowth. Let the Paleocene dawn come if it wants to, the grey light and the low ferns and the small bird finding its seed in the ash. Let the Eocene warmth come if it wants to, the bright forests and the spreading wings and the first songs threading through the high canopy, or let nothing come. Let there be simply the dark and the warmth and the breathing and the comfortable weight of your body settled into rest. Both are equally right. Both are equally what sleep is for. The bird in the tree will be singing before you wake. It will begin in the dark, before the sky has shown any lightning, singing into the night as though to call the dawn rather than to respond to it. And by the time you are fully awake, the chorus will be at its fullest, all the species of your particular place adding their voices to the ancient tradition, and the world outside will sound like it has always sounded on a spring morning, full and complex and alive in ways that 66 million years have made possible. Sleep now, the bird is waiting for the morning is patient, and everything that has ever survived anything has done it the same way you are doing it now, by going quiet, by going still, by trusting the dark to pass and the light to return, as it always has, as it always will. Sleep now, sleep well, the dawn is coming. Dawn is... If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is. I am always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic for the next story, feel free to leave it in the comments. Sleep well wherever in the world you are.